Good evening and welcome back. Today we're diving into the complete story of Greek mythology, so get comfy and comment down below where in the world you're watching from. In the beginning, there was nothing shaped like anything at all. No sky, no ground, no light to fall on either one, just a vast, yawning emptiness, formless and silent, stretching in every direction with no edges to stop it. The Greeks had a word for this nothing. They called it chaos, and they believed that everything, every god, every mountain, every war and love and betrayal that would come after began right here, in this void that existed before existence had rules. Chaos herself, before Gaia rose fully into the light, had produced other children of her own, Erebus, a personification of primeval darkness, and Nyx, the night, two beings who came together to produce an entire brood of forces that would haunt the world for as long as it existed. From Nyx alone, without any partner at all, came Thanatos, the personification of death itself, gentle and inevitable rather than cruel. His twin brother Hypnos, god of sleep, who moved through the world administering rest to gods and mortals alike. The Moirai or Fates, three sisters who would later be counted among Themis's children as well in some tellings, spinning, measuring, and cutting the thread of every life that would ever be lived. Nemesis, goddess of righteous retribution, who would go on to punish Narcissus for his cruelty, and Eris, goddess of discord, whose uninvited arrival at a wedding feast with a single golden apple would one day set an entire war in motion. Even in these earliest, most abstract generations of the cosmos, the world was already being built with both mercy and cruelty woven inseparably into its foundation, long before a single mortal had been shaped to experience either one. Out of that emptiness, something stirred. Not a being, not yet, moory like a pressure building in the dark, the way a storm gathers before the first drop of rain falls. And then, slowly, shapes began to separate themselves from the nothing. Gaia rose first, the earth herself, broad and solid, spreading out beneath a sky that did not yet exist to cover her. Then came Tartarus, a pit so deep and so far beneath the world that even the gods would come to fear it, a place where light did not reach and time did not seem to move the same way it did anywhere else. And then Eros, the raw force of desire and attraction, the pull that would draw beings together for the rest of time, for better and for far, far worse. These were not gods in the way people would later imagine them, no golden hair, no thunderbolts, no throne rooms on a mountaintop. They were forces, elemental, absolute, older than the idea of a face or a name. But Gaia was different. Gaia would become a mother, and not a gentle one. Alone without a partner, Gaia brought forth Uranus, the sky itself, vast and star-filled, stretching up and over her to enclose the world in a dome of night. He was her son. He was also, in the strange logic of these earliest myths, about to become her husband. The primordial world did not run on the rules that would govern human lives later. It ran on necessity. The universe needed shape, needed structure, and Gaia and Uranus, earth and sky, would give it that structure together. From their union came children, many children, and this is where the story stops being gentle. First came the Titans, 12 of them, 6 sons and 6 daughters, towering beings who would come to rule an age of the world before anyone had ever heard the name Zeus. Names like Cronus, Rhea, Oceanus, Themis, Iapetus, and Mnemosyne, titans of memory, of lore, of the ocean, of time itself. They were powerful, yes, but at least they were something Gaia could recognize as her own, flawed, ambitious, but shaped in a way she understood. Then came something else. 3 suns with a single burning eye set in the middle of their foreheads, the Cyclopes, master craftsmen, whose hands would one day forge thunderbolts capable of splitting mountains. And after them, 3 more suns, each with 50 heads and 100 powerful arms erupting from their shoulders, the Hecatoncheires, beings of such overwhelming, monstrous strength that even the word strength feels too small for them. Uranus looked at these children, his own children, and felt something curdle inside him. Not love, not pride, fear. He saw in them a threat to his own power, a suggestion that something born from him and Gaia might one day grow strong enough to take his place. So Uranus did what frightened, powerful beings have done throughout every age of mythology since. He decided to destroy the threat before it could grow. He seized the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, his own sons, and thrust them down into Tartarus, that lightless pit beneath the world, sealing them away where their strength could never be turned against him. Gaia felt every one of those imprisonments like a wound. The earth herself groaned under the weight of what her husband had done, and something in her hardened into resolve. She would not simply mourn, she would act. Deep within herself, Gaia forged a great sickle, jagged and grey, made of the hardest substance she could produce, adamant, unbreakable. And she went to her remaining children, the Titans, and asked a question that would echo through the rest of Greek mythology like the first crack in a dam. Which of you will help me stop him? Silence answered her. Fear of Uranus ran deep, even in beings as powerful as the Titans. All except one. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, stepped forward. There are different ways to tell what happened next. Some accounts paint him as brave, others as simply ambitious, hungry for the throne his father sat on. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps ambition and courage are closer to the same thing than people like to admit. Whatever burned in him, Cronus took the sickle from his mother's hands, and together they set a trap. That night when Uranus came to Gaia as he always did, Cronus was waiting, hidden in the shadows. And when the moment came, he struck, a single brutal blow that severed his father from power in the most literal and violent way imaginable. Uranus reeled back in agony, his blood spilling onto the earth below, and from those drops, something new began to grow. The Erinyes, the Furies, spirits of vengeance who would spend eternity punishing those who wronged their own kin. Even in this founding act of rebellion, the world was already writing the rules for what would happen to those who betrayed their own blood. The remains of Uranus were cast into the sea, and from the foam that churned around them rose Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, born not gently, but out of violence and severed power. A detail that later poets would soften into something beautiful, though the truth beneath it was anything but. Uranus, defeated and dethroned, did not simply fade away. As he was cast down, he turned back toward the children who had betrayed him and spoke a curse, a promise that would hang over Cronus for the rest of his reign. You will suffer the same fate you have given me. Your own child will rise up and take your throne, just as you have taken mine. Cronus did not listen. Power has a way of making warnings sound like other people's problems. He took the throne of the universe, and he took his sister Rhea as his queen, and for a time it seemed as though a new and better age had begun. This was the Golden Age, the stories say, a time when the earth gave freely, when there was no need for labor or war, when Titans ruled a world still young and mostly at peace. Cronus should have been satisfied. He had everything. But his father's curse sat in him like a splinter that would not work its way out. Every time Rhea gave birth, Cronus was there waiting, and one by one he swallowed his own children whole, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each one taken the moment they were born, sealed away inside their own father in an act so unnatural that even the word monstrous feels insufficient. He told himself he was protecting his throne. He told himself this was strength. What he was actually doing was proving his own father's curse right in the most horrifying way possible, becoming exactly the kind of tyrant that had bred rebellion in the first place. Rhea endured this 5 times, 5 children taken from her arms and swallowed before they had drawn more than a few breaths of open air. Something in her broke, and something in her hardened, the same way something had hardened in Gaia generations before. History, it seems, does not merely repeat. It teaches its lessons to whoever is paying attention, and Rhea was paying very close attention indeed. When she became pregnant a sixth time, she went to her mother, Gaia, and to the earth itself for help, and together they devised a plan. Rhea traveled to the island of Crete, hidden away from Cronus's watchful eyes, and there she gave birth to a son. She named him Zeus, and instead of bringing the infant to his father as she had every time before, she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth, presented it to Cronus, and watched as he swallowed it without a second glance, so confident in his own power, so certain that no one would dare deceive him, that he never thought to check. Zeus was carried away into the wild slopes of Mount Ida, hidden in a cave and raised in secret. Some stories say a goat named Amalthea nursed him. Others say nymphs cared for him, or that armored warriors called the Curetes danced and clashed their weapons together outside the cave to drown out the cries of the infant god, so that Cronus, listening from his throne, would hear nothing but silence where a child should have been. And so Zeus grew, not in a palace, not with the trappings of power, but in hiding on a mountainside, raised by secrecy and protected by people who understood exactly what was at stake. Every day he lived was an act of defiance against a father who did not even know he existed. He would not stay hidden forever. Zeus grew into his strength on that mountainside, and as he grew, so did his understanding of what had been taken from him, a mother forced to swallow her own grief, siblings trapped inside their father's body, an entire family held hostage by one god's fear of losing his throne. When he was ready, Zeus came down from Mount Ida, and he did not come alone in spirit, even if he walked into his father's world without an army. He found Metis, a titaness known for her cunning, and together they devised a plan every bit as clever as the one that had saved his life. Metis prepared a potion. Some versions of the story call it an emetic, something designed to force Cronus to do the one thing he never expected to do. Zeus, disguised as a cupbearer, presented it to his father, and Cronus, still unaware that the son he'd swallowed as a stone had grown into a god capable of standing in front of him, drank it without suspicion. What followed was not elegant. Cronus began to vomit, and out came the stone that had once masqueraded as an infant, and then, one after another, Zeus's siblings Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each of them fully grown despite having spent years trapped inside their father, disgorged into the light of a world they had never truly seen. They stood there, blinking, furious and free. 6 gods now stood against Cronus, and the balance of power in the universe had just shifted in a single, violent moment. But Cronus was not without allies. He called on the Titans, most of whom stood with him, the old order, the ones who had ruled since the fall of Uranus and had no interest in giving that power up. A handful sided with Zeus instead, most notably Themis and her son Prometheus, who saw, with a clarity that would define his entire story, which way the future was bending. What came next was a war unlike anything the young universe had seen. The Titanomachy, 10 years of conflict between the old gods and the new, fought across a world still raw and unformed, mountains torn apart, seas boiling, the very fabric of the cosmos shaking under blows meant to end reigns forever. Neither side could gain a lasting advantage. Zeus and his siblings were strong, but the Titans were ancient, and ancient does not mean weak. It was Gaia, once again, who tipped the balance. The same Earth Mother who had helped end Uranus's reign now stepped in to end her own sons. She told Zeus of the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, still imprisoned in Tartarus after all these ages, their monstrous strength wasted in the dark. If Zeus could free them, she said, he would have weapons and allies that could turn the tide. Zeus descended into Tartarus himself. He broke the chains that had held the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires since before he was born, and in gratitude, the Cyclopes forged him gifts that would define him for the rest of his existence. A thunderbolt, capable of striking with the force of the sky itself, a weapon that no armor and no god could fully withstand. For Poseidon, they forged a trident that could shake the earth and command the sea. For Hades, a helm of darkness that rendered its wearer invisible, a tool perfectly suited to a god who would come to rule the unseen world beneath the living one. With the Hecatoncheires fighting at their side, hurling boulders by the hundreds with their many arms, and Zeus wielding a weapon capable of splitting the sky, the war turned decisively. The final battle was less a fight than an unmaking. Mountains that had stood since the Earth's earliest age were torn from their roots and hurled across the battlefield like pebbles, entire valleys collapsing under the weight of blows meant for gods rather than for the ground beneath them. The sea itself was said to boil in places where the fighting raged closest to the shore, and the sky churned black with a storm that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the sheer violence being unleashed beneath it. Zeus's thunderbolts tore through the ranks of the old order, one bolt alone said to be capable of splitting a mountain in half, and he did not throw them sparingly. The war had dragged on for a full decade already, and he meant to end it decisively rather than risk another 10 years of stalemate. The Hecatoncheires, each one hurling boulders by the hundreds with their many arms in a single continuous, relentless barrage, buried entire companies of Titan warriors beneath avalanches of stone before they could even close ranks to fight back. Their monstrous, many-armed forms finally given the chance to unleash a strength that had sat wasted and imprisoned for longer than most gods had even existed. The Titans, for all their age and power, could not stand against gifts forged in the deepest pit of the universe and wielded by gods who had everything to prove. The final battle was less a fight than an unmaking. Zeus's thunderbolts tore through the ranks of the old order. The Hecatoncheires buried mountains under mountains, burying resistance beneath them. And when it was over, Cronus and most of the Titans who had stood with him were defeated, captured, and cast down into Tartarus themselves, sealed away in the same pit that had once held Zeus's rescuers, guarded now by the Hecatoncheires, who understood better than anyone what it meant to be trapped there and had no intention of ever going back. Atlas, one of the Titans who had fought hardest against Zeus, was given a punishment suited exactly to his defiance, condemned to hold up the sky itself for eternity, bearing on his shoulders the very thing his side had fought to control. The war was over. The age of the Titans had ended, and the age of the Olympians had begun. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, the three brothers who had once been swallowed whole and were now the most powerful beings in existence, divided the universe among themselves, the story goes, by drawing lots. Zeus took the sky, becoming king of the gods and ruler of the heavens. Poseidon took the sea, master of every wave and current, and the earthquakes that shook the ground when his temper ran short. Hades took the underworld, the realm of the dead, a domain that other gods rarely visited, and that he himself would rule with a grim, largely misunderstood fairness. The earth and Olympus itself remained common ground, shared among them all. Hades's realm was no simple pit of darkness, but an entire geography unto itself, bordered by 5 rivers whose names became as familiar to the Greeks as any coastline above ground, the Styx, by which even the gods swore their most unbreakable oaths. The Acheron, the river of woe that the dead had to cross, ferried across its waters by the grim boatman Charon, who demanded a single coin as payment, a custom that led Greek families to place a coin beneath the tongue of their own dead to ensure safe passage. The Lethe, whose waters brought total forgetfulness to any soul who drank from them, erasing the memory of their entire mortal life. The Phlegethon, a river of fire, and the Cocytus, a river of wailing and lamentation. At the gates stood Cerberus, the 3-headed hound Heracles would one day wrestle into submission, allowing souls to enter freely but never permitting a single one to leave. Deep within, the dead were judged by 3 former mortal kings, elevated to the task for their wisdom and fairness in life. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who sorted the newly arrived into their final resting places. The bleak, grey fields of asphodel for ordinary souls who had lived neither exceptionally well nor exceptionally badly. The torment of Tartarus, that same lightless pit that had once held the Titans, reserved now for history's worst offenders and their punishments. And the Elysian fields, a paradise of eternal springtime and comfort, reserved for the truly heroic and the especially favored by the gods, a rare mercy in a mythology that so rarely offered mortals a happy ending at all. A mountain was chosen as the seat of this new order, Olympus, its peak wreathed in cloud, far above the world of mortals, and there Zeus began to build not just a home but a court, a family, a new mythology to replace the old one his father had ruled. Hestia tended the sacred hearth, and though her presence appears only rarely in the dramatic conflicts that fill so much of this mythology, her role was considered essential beyond almost any other Olympians. She had been courted by both Poseidon and Apollo in her youth, and rather than choose between them and risk the jealousy such a choice would inevitably provoke, she asked Zeus for permission to remain forever unmarried, a request he granted along with the honor of receiving the first offering at every sacrifice made to any god, a quiet but permanent recognition of the hearth's place at the center of every home, every temple, and every meal shared in the ancient Greek world. Demeter would come to govern the harvest and the turning of the seasons. Hera, in time, would become Zeus's queen, though their marriage would prove to be one of the most turbulent unions in the history of the gods. But the age of conflict was not finished yet. There was one more war to come, a rebellion not from Titans this time, but from creatures born of Gaia's fury, monstrous and enormous, called the Giants, who rose up in one last attempt to challenge Olympus and failed just as completely as the Titans before them, with mortal heroes eventually called in to help finish what the gods alone could not. And even after that, Gaia had one final weapon to unleash. Furious that her children, first the Titans, then the Giants, had been defeated and imprisoned by Zeus, she coupled with Tartarus itself and produced Typhon, a monster so vast and so terrible that some tellings describe him as taller than the mountains, with 100 serpent heads, fire in his eyes, and a voice that could shift between the roar of a bull and the shriek of something no mortal ear should ever hear. Typhon nearly succeeded where the Titans and Giants had failed. In the first clash between Typhon and the Olympians, panic spread even among the gods. Some accounts say they fled to Egypt and disguised themselves as animals to escape his fury, a detail later used to explain the animal-headed gods of Egyptian religion. Zeus alone stood his ground, and even he was overwhelmed at first. Typhon managed to steal the sinews from Zeus's limbs, leaving the king of the gods helpless, until Hermes and the goat god Pan managed to steal them back. Restored to his full strength, Zeus returned to finish the fight, hurling thunderbolt after thunderbolt until Typhon was beaten down and finally buried beneath Mount Etna, where the Greeks believed his rage still simmered beneath the earth, occasionally boiling over as an eruption whenever his fury flared anew. Typhon did not remain without a mate for long, and his union with Echidna, a monstrous being who was half beautiful woman and half serpent, produced an entire lineage of horrors that would go on to haunt nearly every hero this mythology would eventually produce. From that pairing came the Hydra of Lerna, the many-headed serpent Heracles would one day face in his second labor, the Chimera, the fire-breathing hybrid of lion, goat, and serpent that Bellerophon would strike down from the back of Pegasus, Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the gates of the underworld, and that Heracles would eventually wrestle into submission as his final labor. And the Sphinx, whose riddle would one day determine the fate of an unsuspecting traveler named Oedipus on the road to Thebes. Nearly every monster, a mortal hero would ever face across the coming generations, traced its lineage back to this single, terrible union between the last child of Gaia's fury and the serpent woman who mothered his brood. A reminder that even after Zeus's throne seemed secure, the raw, untamed chaos of the world's earliest age never fully disappeared, only scattered itself across the earth to wait patiently for a hero brave or foolish enough to come looking for it. With Typhon defeated, the age of chaos was finally, truly over. The Olympians ruled unchallenged, and it was time for the world itself, and the mortals who would come to inhabit it, to be shaped by the very gods who had just fought to control it. The Titans themselves, before the war that unseated them, had governed an astonishing range of the young universe's fundamental forces, and their names and domains would echo forward through the rest of the mythology in ways easy to overlook amid the drama of gods and heroes. Oceanus and his sister-wife Tethys ruled the great river the Greeks believed encircled the entire flat disk of the world, parents to 3,000 river gods and as many ocean nymphs, an endless, sprawling family that touched nearly every stream and coastline in Greek geography. Hyperion, god of light, fathered Helios the sun, Selene the moon, and Eos the dawn, a trio who would take over the daily labor of lighting and darkening the sky long after their father's own generation had fallen from power. Themis, goddess of divine law and order, later became one of Zeus's own consorts and bore him the fates themselves, three sisters who spun, measured, and cut the thread of every mortal life, answering to no god, not even Zeus, once a thread had been cut. Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, lay with Zeus for 9 consecutive nights and gave birth to the 9 muses, goddesses who would go on to inspire poetry, music, history, and astronomy in every mortal artist who ever called upon them for guidance. Among the Titans who had chosen wisely and sided with Zeus during the war was Prometheus, whose name meant something close to forethought, a fitting name for a being who always seemed to see further ahead than everyone around him. It was Prometheus, some versions of the myth say, who shaped the first humans out of clay and water, kneeling in the mud of the young earth to mold something new into existence, a creature that walked upright like the gods, but was fragile, mortal, dependent on the world around it, in ways the gods never had to be. Zeus and the Olympians allowed these mortals to exist, but they did not exactly cherish them. Humans were an afterthought in a universe built by gods for gods, small and short-lived, useful mostly as worshippers who could burn offerings and speak prayers upward toward Olympus. Prometheus felt differently. Whether out of pride in his own creation or simple compassion, he began to care for humanity in a way none of the other Titans or Olympians did. It started with a trick. At a feast meant to settle how sacrifices should be divided between gods and mortals, Prometheus prepared 2 portions from a slaughtered ox, one wrapped in glistening fat but containing only bones, the other far less appealing to look at, plain and unadorned, but containing all the actual meat. He offered Zeus first choice, and Zeus, either genuinely fooled or, as some tellings suggest, fully aware of the trick and choosing to play along so he'd have an excuse for what came next, chose the portion wrapped in fat. When Zeus discovered the deception, his fury was immense, and it fell not on Prometheus alone, but on humanity as a whole. As punishment, he withheld fire from mortals, no warmth against the cold, no way to cook the meat they had just been granted the better share of, no light to hold back the dark. It was a small, petty cruelty compared to some of what would follow in Greek mythology, but it was devastating to a species just beginning to find its footing in a harsh world. Prometheus could not stand to watch it. He crept to Olympus, or in some versions to the workshop of Hephaestus, and stole a spark of fire, hiding it inside a hollow fennel stalk, and carried it down to the mortals below. Humanity had fire again, the ability to cook, to forge metal, to hold back the dark and the cold, the beginning of everything that would eventually become civilization itself. Zeus's rage this time was not petty, it was absolute. He had Prometheus seized and chained to a remote mountain, the Caucasus in most tellings, bound with unbreakable bonds forged by Hephaestus himself. Each day, an eagle sent by Zeus would descend and tear open Prometheus's side, devouring his liver. Each night, because Prometheus was immortal, the liver would regenerate, whole again, ready for the eagle to return the following day and begin the torment all over. It was a punishment built not just to hurt, but to hurt forever, an infinite loop of agony with no end in sight. Prometheus endured this for what the myths describe as thousands of years, though ages meant something different to beings who existed outside of mortal time, bound to that rock, watching the world he had helped create continue on without him, still refusing, even in his suffering, to regret what he had done. He would eventually be freed, generations later, by the hero Heracles, but that release was still an unimaginable stretch of time away, and for now, Prometheus simply endured. Zeus was not finished punishing humanity, either. If fire had given mortals power they weren't meant to have, he decided, then he would give them something else in return, something that looked like a gift, but was constructed to be anything but. He commanded Hephaestus to shape a woman out of clay and water, just as Prometheus had once shaped the first humans, and each of the gods added something to her. Aphrodite gave her beauty. Athene gave her skill in craft. Hermes gave her a persuasive tongue, and depending on which version of the story you trust, a nature inclined toward curiosity and cunning. They named her Pandora, all-gifted, and sent her down to earth as a bride for Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, whose name, fittingly, meant afterthought, a being who tended to act first and consider the consequences later, exactly the opposite of his cautious brother. Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept gifts from Zeus. Epimetheus, true to his nature, did not listen. Pandora arrived carrying a jar, later mistranslated across centuries into the far more famous box that Zeus had explicitly instructed her never to open. It was, of course, exactly the kind of instruction that guarantees its own failure. Whether it was curiosity or a trap built directly into her nature by the gods who had crafted her, Pandora eventually lifted the lid and outpoured everything that would come to define the hardships of human life. Sickness, grief, envy, old age, war, poverty, every misery that mortals had never known before that moment came rushing out into the world all at once. Pandora slammed the lid shut in horror, but it was too late. Only one thing remained trapped inside the jar: hope. Whether hope had been sealed in to comfort humanity through the miseries that had just been unleashed, or trapped in there as one final cruelty, hope forever withheld, just out of reach, is a question the ancient sources themselves never fully agreed on, and it remains one of the most argued over details in the entire myth. From that day forward, humanity lived in a harder world, no longer innocent, no longer protected from suffering, carrying the weight of everything Pandora's jar had released. The gods, watching this early version of humanity from Olympus, eventually grew displeased with what mortals had become. Different ages passed in the old stories: a golden age under the Titans, a silver age of humans too foolish to honor the gods properly, a bronze age of humans who did nothing but make war on each other, until Zeus, disgusted by the corruption and violence he saw spreading across the earth, particularly by a king named Lycaon, who is said to have served him human flesh at a feast to test whether he was truly a god, decided to wipe the slate clean. He sent a flood. Rain fell without stopping, rivers rose beyond their banks, and the world mortals had built was swallowed whole. Only two survived: Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha, warned in advance by Prometheus's foresight and instructed to build a chest large enough to carry them through the deluge. When the waters finally receded and their chest came to rest on a mountainside, they found themselves alone in a drowned world, the last two humans left alive. They prayed for guidance and were told to throw the bones of their mother behind them as they walked. Confused at first, whose mother and what bones, Deucalion realized the answer. The earth was mother to them all, and her bones were the stones littering the ground beneath their feet. As they walked and threw stones over their shoulders without looking back, the stones Deucalion threw became men, and the stones Pyrrha threw became women, and humanity began again, hardier this time, shaped from the bones of the earth itself rather than clay alone. The world had been broken and remade. The Titans had fallen, the Olympians had risen, Prometheus had paid an unimaginable price for humanity's fire, and mortals themselves had been nearly erased and then given a second chance. What came next was the long, unfolding age of the gods themselves, their loves, their rivalries, their children, and the strange, complicated relationship they would maintain with the mortals living far below their mountain. An age that would produce some of the richest and strangest stories the ancient world ever told. On Olympus, Zeus ruled as king, but ruling and being faithful were two very different things to him, and the difference would define the tone of an enormous portion of Greek mythology for centuries to come. He married Hera, goddess of marriage and family, an irony that would only grow sharper with time, given how thoroughly Zeus would go on to violate the very institution his wife presided over. Hera was no passive queen. She was proud, powerful, fiercely protective of her position, and she possessed a memory for betrayal that never seemed to dim. Zeus pursued goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women alike, fathering children across every corner of the world he ruled, and Hera's response was rarely aimed at her husband directly. Confronting Zeus himself was, even for her, a dangerous proposition. Instead, her fury fell on the women Zeus pursued, and on the children born from those unions, in stories that stretch across the entire mythology like a single long thread of jealousy and consequence. Consider Io, a mortal priestess Zeus fell for, and in an attempt to hide his affair, transformed into a white heifer. Hera was not fooled for a moment. She demanded the heifer as a gift. Zeus, unable to refuse without confessing everything, had no choice but to hand her over, and Hera set the hundred-eyed giant Argus to guard her endlessly, ensuring Zeus could never approach again. Zeus eventually sent Hermes to lull Argus to sleep with a long, winding story and slay him, freeing Io. But Hera was not finished. She sent a biting gadfly to torment the transformed girl, driving her in a frenzied, wandering flight across much of the known world before Io was finally restored to human form, far from home and forever marked by the ordeal. Or consider Leto, a titaness who caught Zeus's attention and became pregnant with twins. Hera, enraged, forbade any land under the sun from offering Leto a place to give birth, and drove her into a desperate, wandering search for somewhere, anywhere, that would take her in. Only the floating island of Delos, technically not fixed to any land and therefore exempt from Hera's decree, agreed to shelter her. There, after days of labor prolonged by Hera's continued interference, Leto finally gave birth to Artemis first, and then, with her newborn daughter's help, to Apollo. Twins born of struggle and defiance, Apollo and Artemis grew to become two of the most important gods on Olympus. Apollo took on domains of extraordinary range: the sun, music, poetry, prophecy, healing, and the plague that could just as easily be his to unleash as to cure. He would become the god associated with the great oracle at Delphi, a shrine seized from an enormous serpent named Python that Hera had sent to hunt Leto before Apollo was even born. The infant god, barely days old, is said to have marched to Delphi and slain the serpent himself, claiming the sacred site as his own in an act of vengeance that also happened to found one of the most important religious centers in the ancient Greek world. Apollo's own romantic pursuits rarely ended well for the women and youths who caught his attention, and none illustrated that pattern more clearly than his pursuit of Daphne, a nymph devoted, like Artemis's followers, to a life free of marriage and romantic entanglement. The trouble began, fittingly enough, with an insult to another god entirely. Apollo, freshly triumphant over Python, mocked the young Eros for playing with a bow and arrows he assumed were toys unsuited to a child. Unaware he was insulting the one god whose arrows could make even Apollo himself powerless to resist. Eros, strung by the mockery, fired 2 arrows in retaliation, a golden one into Apollo, inflaming him with sudden, uncontrollable desire, and a leaden one into Daphne, filling her with an equally sudden and absolute revulsion toward love. Apollo pursued her relentlessly through the forest, and Daphne fled just as relentlessly until her strength finally began to give out, and Apollo's hand drew close enough to nearly catch her. In desperation, she cried out to her father, a river god, begging him to destroy the very beauty that had drawn Apollo's pursuit in the first place, and as Apollo's fingers finally closed around her, her skin began to harden into bark, her arms stretched upward into branches, her hair unfurled into rustling leaves, and her feet rooted themselves into the earth. She had become a laurel tree, forever beyond his reach. Apollo, grieving what he could never have, declared the laurel sacred to him from that day forward, weaving its leaves into a crown he would wear for the rest of eternity, and decreeing that laurel wreaths would crown the heads of poets, athletes, and victors for as long as the Greek world continued to honor him. Artemis, meanwhile, became goddess of the hunt, of the wilderness, of the moon, fiercely independent and famously protective of her chosen virginity, surrounded by nymphs who swore the same vow and punished, sometimes with terrifying severity, anyone who violated the sanctity of her domain or her followers. Where Apollo moved through the world of gods and mortals with a kind of golden, confident ease, Artemis kept to the wild edges, more comfortable among forests and mountains than palaces. Athene's birth was stranger still. Zeus, warned by a prophecy that a child born of his first wife, Metis, the same clever Titaness who had once helped him force Cronus to disgorge his siblings, would grow powerful enough to overthrow him, took no chances. He swallowed Metis whole while she was already pregnant, hoping to prevent the prophecy from ever coming true. But the pregnancy continued inside him, and eventually Zeus began suffering blinding headaches unlike anything he had ever experienced. Desperate, he had Hephaestus split his skull open with an axe, and out sprang Athene, fully grown, fully armored, and already brilliant, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and civilized warfare, born not from a womb, but from her father's own mind, in the most literal sense imaginable. Hephaestus himself had a harder beginning. Some versions say Hera bore him alone, without Zeus, in a kind of retaliation for Athene's strange birth, and that she was so repulsed by his appearance as an infant, described in various tellings as sickly or deformed, that she cast him off Olympus entirely, hurling him down to earth where he fell for a full day before landing, his leg shattered in the fall, a limp that would mark him for the rest of his existence. He was taken in by sea nymphs and raised far from Olympus, and it was there, in isolation, that he taught himself the craft that would eventually make him indispensable to every god who had once rejected him. The forging of armor, weapons, and wonders no other hand in the universe could match. Eventually, he found his way back to Olympus, and though the gods needed his craft desperately, his relationship with his mother and with his eventual wife Aphrodite remained some of the most fraught in the entire pantheon. Ares, god of war, was born of Zeus and Hera together, but he never seemed to earn the same respect his siblings commanded. Where Athene represented war as strategy, discipline, and the protection of a city, Ares embodied its opposite, the chaos of battle, the bloodlust, the raw violence stripped of any higher purpose. Even his own father is said to have called him the most hateful of all the gods on Olympus. And while Ares found favor with Aphrodite, whose passionate and destructive affair with him became one of the more famous scandals of Olympus. Aphrodite had been married off to Hephaestus by Zeus himself, a match many suspected was designed less as an honor and more as a means of pacifying the gods' own considerable pride at having a wife so far above what his appearance and low standing among the other Olympians might otherwise have earned him. Whatever the reasoning behind the marriage, Aphrodite found little satisfaction in it, and she and Ares carried on a passionate affair conducted, they believed, in careful secrecy, meeting whenever Hephaestus was occupied at his forge. It was Helios, the sun god who saw everything the daylight touched on his journey across the sky, who first spotted the lovers together and reported the affair directly to Hephaestus. Rather than confronting them in a jealous rage, Hephaestus turned his considerable craft toward a quieter and far more humiliating revenge. He forged a net of chains so fine they were nearly invisible to the eye, yet strong enough that no god could break them, and rigged it above his own marriage bed, then announced a sudden trip away from Olympus. The moment he was gone, Ares and Aphrodite slipped into the bed together exactly as Hephaestus had anticipated, and the net dropped over them instantly, binding the two lovers together, naked and utterly unable to free themselves. Hephaestus, who had never actually left, summoned the rest of the Olympian gods to come witness the spectacle, and the gods gathered at his doorway to laugh at the tangled, humiliated pair, unable to so much as cover themselves in front of the entire assembled pantheon. Poseidon, eventually taking pity on the lovers, rather than continuing to laugh with the others, persuaded Hephaestus to release them, promising that Ares would pay a fine for the offense against a fellow god's marriage. Ares and Aphrodite fled from the humiliation in opposite directions, and though the affair itself continued on and off for years afterward, that single, humiliating net remained one of the most retold scenes from the entire Olympian court, a reminder that even a god as skilled at armor and weapons as Hephaestus could win a war fought entirely without violence, using nothing but patience, cunning, and a well-timed piece of craftsmanship. Hermes, born to Zeus and the nymph Maia, showed his character within hours of being born, stealing Apollo's sacred cattle on the very day of his birth, cleverly disguising their tracks, and then, when caught, charming his way out of serious punishment by inventing the lyre from a tortoise shell and gifting it to Apollo as recompense, an offering so unexpectedly wonderful that Apollo's fury dissolved into delight. From that first day, Hermes became the god of travelers, thieves, messengers, and boundaries of every kind, the one god equally comfortable among the Olympians, mortals, and the dead, serving as the guide who led souls down to the underworld when their time came. Poseidon, ruling the sea from a glittering underwater palace, took as his own queen the nymph Amphitrite, one of the many daughters of the old sea titan Oceanus, though her courtship began with considerably less enthusiasm on her part than the marriage eventually suggested. Wary of Poseidon's temperament and unwilling to be simply claimed the way so many other gods claimed the women they desired, Amphitrite fled to the farthest depths of the ocean rather than accept his proposal, hiding among the underwater caverns at the very edge of the known sea. Poseidon sent messengers in every direction to find her, and it was a dolphin, according to the story the Greeks told, who finally located her hiding place and persuaded her, through gentle and patient argument rather than force, to return and accept the sea god as her husband. Grateful for the creature's role in finally winning her over, Poseidon placed the dolphin among the stars as a constellation, a small, rare instance of tenderness in a mythology far more often defined by the opposite. Demeter, goddess of the harvest and growing things, held a quieter, but no less essential role, her moods dictating whether the earth flourished or withered, a power that would come to define one of the most devastating and personal tragedies any Olympian would ever experience, tied directly to Hades and the underworld he ruled. And then there was Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation, whose birth was as strange as it was violent. His mother, Semele, a mortal woman Zeus had fallen for, was tricked by a jealous Hera, disguised as an old nurse, into asking Zeus to reveal himself to her in his full divine glory, a request Zeus had already sworn by the unbreakable river Styx to grant, no matter what it was. He tried to warn her against it. She insisted. And when Zeus finally appeared before her in his true form, the sheer power of it incinerated her instantly. Zeus, in a desperate final act, snatched the unborn child from her body and sewed him into his own thigh, carrying him to term himself and giving birth to Dionysus a second time when the months were up, the only god in the entire pantheon born twice, once from a mortal mother and once from Zeus himself. Zeus's wandering attention was not confined to goddesses and mortal women alone. Struck by the beauty of a Trojan shepherd boy named Ganymede, considered the most beautiful mortal who had ever lived, Zeus transformed himself into an eagle swept down from Olympus, and carried the boy away to serve as cupbearer to the gods, a position of high honor that nonetheless meant Ganymede would never again see the family or the mortal life he had been taken from. His grieving father was compensated, in the era's particular moral logic, with a gift of fine horses and the assurance that his son had been granted immortality among the gods. Cold comfort, perhaps, but consistent with how casually Zeus's desires tended to reorder the lives of anyone who caught his eye, mortal or divine, willing or not. Callisto, a nymph and devoted follower of Artemis, sworn to the same vow of chastity that governed the goddess's entire retinue, caught Zeus's attention next, and he approached her disguised as Artemis herself to get close enough to deceive her. When Callisto's resulting pregnancy became impossible to hide, Artemis, furious at the broken vow regardless of how it had actually come about, banished her from the group entirely. Hera, discovering the affair, as she always eventually did, transformed Callisto into a bear out of pure jealousy, condemning her to wander the wilderness in that form for years. Callisto's son, Arcas, grew up to become a skilled hunter himself, and one day, out in the forest, very nearly killed his own transformed mother without any way of recognizing her. An arrow drawn and aimed before Zeus intervened at the last possible moment, sweeping them both up into the sky as the constellations of the Great Bear and the Little Bear, mother and son placed together among the stars rather than separated by a tragedy neither of them had any hand in causing. Many of the era's greatest heroes shared something else in common beyond their divine parentage, a childhood spent, at least in part, under the tutelage of Chiron, a centaur unlike any other member of his notoriously wild and violent race. Where most centaurs were known for drunken brawling and uncontrolled appetite, Chiron was wise, gentle, and extraordinarily learned in medicine, music, prophecy, and the art of war, a teacher sought out by kings and gods alike who wanted their sons raised properly. Jason, Achilles, and Heracles himself all spent time in Chiron's care on the slopes of Mount Pelion, learning skills that would define their later legends. Chiron's own story ended in a particularly bitter irony for a healer of his renown, accidentally wounded by one of Heracles' arrows, tipped, like so many others, with the Hydra's incurable poison. Chiron suffered an agony that his own vast medical knowledge could do nothing to ease. Immortal by birth and therefore unable to simply die and end his suffering, he eventually arranged to trade his immortality to free Prometheus from his own endless torment on the mountainside, a final act of sacrifice that let him finally pass into death and rest, while earning Prometheus, at long last, a measure of the relief he had waited so many centuries to receive. Together, these gods, Zeus and Hera, Poseidon and Hades, Demeter and Hestia, Apollo and Artemis, Athene, Hephaestus, Ares, Aphrodite, Hermes, and eventually Dionysus, formed the 12 Olympians, ruling from their mountain over a world of mortals who would spend the coming centuries building temples, offering sacrifices, and telling stories about a family as dysfunctional, jealous, loving, and vindictive as any that has ever existed, divine or otherwise. Of all the relationships among the Olympians, few carried more weight for the mortal world than the bond between Demeter and her daughter, Persephone, a story that would come to explain, in the Greek imagination, why the earth itself seemed to die and come back to life every single year. Persephone was young, radiant, and closely guarded by her mother, who doted on her with a protectiveness that bordered on the fierce. She spent her days in meadows thick with flowers, surrounded by nymphs. Far from the darker corners of the world, her uncle Hades ruled beneath the earth. But Hades had seen her, and Hades, solitary, often overlooked among the more flamboyant Olympians, ruling a kingdom that no one particularly wanted to visit, had decided he wanted her for his queen. He approached Zeus, Persephone's father, and asked for permission to take her as his wife. Zeus, never eager to involve himself directly in consequences he could avoid, neither firmly granted nor firmly denied the request, which Hades, perhaps rightly, interpreted as tacit approval to simply take what he wanted. One day, while Persephone wandered a meadow with her companions, she noticed a flower unlike any she had ever seen, a narcissus, unusually beautiful, blooming alone at a distance from the others. Some tellings suggest Gaia herself grew it there at Zeus's request, a deliberate lure. Persephone reached to pick it, and the earth split open beneath her without warning. Hades rose from the chasm in his chariot, seized her, and pulled her down into the underworld before she could even cry out fully. The earth's ceiling shut again above them, as though nothing had happened at all. Demeter heard her daughter's scream echo across the world, but could not find its source. She searched for 9 days and 9 nights, refusing food, refusing rest, wandering the earth disguised as an old woman, and questioning everyone she met, until finally Hecate, goddess of the crossroads and magic, told her she had heard the abduction but hadn't seen who was responsible. Together they went to Helios, the sun god who saw everything the light touched during his daily journey across the sky, and Helios told her the truth. Hades had taken Persephone with Zeus's approval. Demeter's grief curdled into something closer to fury, aimed squarely at Olympus itself. She abandoned her divine duties entirely, refusing to let anything grow, refusing to let the earth bear fruit or grain, wandering the world in the guise of an old woman while famine spread across every field and orchard. Mortals began to starve. Sacrifices to the gods stopped because there was nothing left to sacrifice. Even Olympus itself began to feel the consequences of a goddess so consumed by loss that she no longer cared what happened to the world beneath her. Zeus, watching an entire civilization collapse under his daughter's grief, eventually had no choice but to intervene. He sent Hermes down into the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return, and Hades, cornered but not without leverage of his own, agreed to let her go, but not before offering her a handful of pomegranate seeds, which she ate, not fully understanding what that simple act would cost her. In the logic of the underworld, to eat the food of the dead was to become bound to that world forever, and Persephone, having swallowed even a few seeds, could not be fully released. A compromise was struck, one that would shape the seasons themselves. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother above the earth, and the rest of the year below with Hades as queen of the underworld. When mother and daughter were together, Demeter allowed the world to flourish, spring bloomed, crops grew tall, the earth gave freely just as it had during the old golden age. But when Persephone descended each year to join her husband below, Demeter's grief returned with her, and the world grew cold and barren, the fields lying empty and grey until her daughters returned the following year. It was, in its own strange way, one of the gentler stories to come out of the age of the Olympians, a myth about loss and reunion, written into the turning of the seasons themselves, a yearly reminder that even grief as vast as Demeter's eventually gives way, if only for a while, to something like hope. And it set a pattern that would repeat throughout the mythology to come, gods reaching down into mortal lives, and mortal lives forever changed by the touch of something far larger than themselves. The Olympians had claimed their thrones, built their court, fought off every challenge the old order could send against them, and settled into an age that would last, in the imagination of the Greeks, for as long as the world itself continued to turn. But gods alone do not make for a complete mythology. It was time for mortals to step forward, men and women who would dare to interact directly with these overwhelming forces, who would be blessed by them, cursed by them, fathered by them, and who would go on to become heroes whose names would outlive the civilizations that first told their stories. Before the age of great heroes truly began in earnest, the gods had already established, through a handful of smaller but no less memorable stories, exactly what happened to mortals who forgot their place. There was Arachne, a weaver of extraordinary skill, so talented that people whispered she must have learned her craft directly from Athene herself. Rather than accepting the compliment gracefully, Arachne boasted that her skill was entirely her own, and that she could outweave the goddess if given the chance to prove it. Athene, disguised as an old woman, warned her to reconsider and show proper humility, and when Arachne only doubled down, insisting she'd welcome a direct contest, the goddess dropped her disguise and accepted the challenge herself. Athene wove a tapestry depicting the glory of the gods and the folly of mortals who dared to challenge them, a work of flawless, dignified beauty. Arachne, refusing to be intimidated, wove a tapestry of her own depicting the gods' worst moral failures, Zeus's many deceptions and affairs among them, technically perfect in every stitch, and if anything, more honest than Athene's. Athene, unable to find a single flaw in the actual craftsmanship, but enraged by the disrespectful subject matter, tore the tapestry to shreds and struck Arachne with her shuttle. Arachne, humiliated and despairing, tried to hang herself, and Athene, whether out of a final flicker of mercy or simply to prolong the punishment, transformed the rope into a web and Arachne herself into a spider, condemned to weave for the rest of eternity, but never again for human admiration, only as the small, forgotten creature whose name would forever after describe her kind. There was King Midas, ruler of Phrygia, who did an old satyr named Silenus, a companion of Dionysus, a kindness by returning him safely after he wandered drunk into the king's rose garden. Dionysus, grateful, offered Midas any single wish he desired, and Midas, dazzled by dreams of endless wealth, asked that everything he touched turn instantly to gold. The god granted it, and Midas, delighted, spent his first hours testing the gift joyfully. Twigs, stones, an entire apple tree, all transformed to gleaming gold beneath his fingers. The joy did not survive dinner. The food on his plate turned to inedible metal the moment his fingers brushed it, and the wine in his cup hardened to gold before he could take a single sip. In a moment of horror that eclipsed every fantasy of wealth he had ever entertained, his own daughter ran to embrace him, and she too turned instantly into a lifeless golden statue in his arms. Midas, now desperate and grief-stricken rather than greedy, begged Dionysus to take the gift back, and the god, taking pity, instructed him to wash in the waters of the river Pactolus, which stripped the golden touch from him and left its sands forever glittering with traces of gold, as a reminder of exactly how close greed had come to costing him everything that actually mattered. Midas, having barely escaped one lesson in humility, walked directly into another not long after, when he judged a musical contest between the god Apollo and the satyr Marsyas, or in some versions between Apollo and the goat-legged god Pan, and alone among the judges favored the earthier, rustic music over Apollo's refined lyre. Apollo, insulted that a mortal would rate his music beneath anyone else's, punished Midas by giving him the ears of a donkey, a humiliation Midas tried desperately to hide beneath his crown for the rest of his life, known only to the servant who cut his hair, who was so burdened by the secret that he eventually whispered it into a hole in the ground rather than speak it to another living person, only for reeds to grow from that very spot and whisper the secret to the wind every time they swayed, until the whole world knew anyway. There was Narcissus, a young man so extraordinarily beautiful that everyone who saw him fell instantly and helplessly in love, and who rejected every single one of them with a coldness that bordered on cruelty. Among his admirers was a nymph named Echo, cursed by Hera for her constant chattering, meant, in one version, to distract the goddess, while Zeus pursued other nymphs, to only ever repeat the final words spoken to her, never able to originate a thought of her own again. Unable to properly confess her feelings, Echo could only follow Narcissus at a distance, repeating fragments of what he said, until he cruelly rejected her as he had everyone else, and she withered away in heartbreak until nothing remained of her but her voice, still echoing back the last words anyone speaks near her to this day. The goddess Nemesis, hearing of Narcissus's endless cruelty toward those who loved him, decided he deserved to understand exactly what it felt like to love someone who could never love him back. She led him to a still, clear pool of water, and there, gazing down at his own reflection for the first time, Narcissus fell instantly and completely in love with the beautiful face staring back up at him, not understanding it was his own. He could not look away, could not eat, could not sleep, wasting away on the bank of that pool as he pined for a reflection that could never reach back or return his affection, until he died there, still staring into the water, and in his place grew a flower that bears his name to this day, forever bowed toward still water, as though still looking for its own reflection. There was Actaeon, a skilled young hunter, who, wandering the forest with his hounds, stumbled by pure accident upon Artemis bathing naked in a hidden spring with her attendant nymphs. Furious at being seen in such a vulnerable state by mortal eyes, regardless of how unintentional the intrusion had been, Artemis transformed him instantly into a stag, stripping him of his human voice so he could not call out to identify himself. His own hunting hounds, no longer recognizing their master beneath the antlers and hide, tore him apart in the very forest he had hunted through his entire life, a punishment whose severity, even among the gods, would be debated by mortals for centuries to come as one of the more chillingly disproportionate responses in the entire mythology. And there was Pygmalion, a sculptor from Cyprus so disillusioned with the flawed, imperfect women he encountered in life that he swore off romance entirely and poured his devotion instead into his craft, carving a female figure from ivory so exquisite, so lifelike, that he found himself falling in love with his own creation, a woman who would never disappoint him because she was not, technically, a woman at all. He dressed her, brought her gifts, spoke to her as though she could hear him, and prayed at the festival of Aphrodite that the goddess might grant him a bride as perfect as the statue he had carved. Aphrodite, moved by the sincerity, if not the strangeness, of his devotion, granted the wish in the most literal way possible. Returning home, Pygmalion kissed the statue as he always did, and felt, to his astonishment, warmth where there had only ever been cold ivory before. The statue's skin softened beneath his hands, her eyes opened, and she stepped down from her pedestal a living woman, whom later tradition would name Galatea. They married, and theirs became one of the rare stories in this entire mythology to end not in tragedy or transformation as punishment, but in something close to a genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Proof, perhaps, that even among gods so quick to curse and punish, mercy occasionally found its way through as well. Few mortal love stories in the entire mythology carried as much drama or as happy a final resolution as that of Psyche, a mortal princess so beautiful that people began neglecting Aphrodite's temples to admire her instead, whispering that she surpassed the goddess of beauty herself. Aphrodite, predictably furious at the comparison, sent her own son Eros to make Psyche fall hopelessly in love with the most vile, wretched creature he could find as punishment, only for Eros, catching sight of Psyche himself, to accidentally prick his own hand with one of his arrows and fall desperately in love with her instead. Psyche, meanwhile, found herself unable to attract any suitor at all, her beauty apparently too intimidating for ordinary men, until an oracle declared that she was fated to marry a monster and should be left on a mountaintop to await her strange husband. She was carried instead by the gentle west wind Zephyrus to a magnificent hidden palace, where an unseen husband visited her only in the darkness of night, forbidding her ever to look upon his face, though he treated her with tenderness and asked only for her trust in return. Psyche's jealous sisters, visiting and suspicious of a marriage so shrouded in secrecy, convinced her that her mysterious husband must in fact be the monster the oracle had warned of, and urged her to light a lamp while he slept to see the truth for herself, keeping a knife ready in case she needed to defend herself. That night, lamp in one hand and blade in the other, Psyche crept to her sleeping husband's side and discovered, to her astonishment, not a monster but Eros himself, the most beautiful of all the gods, asleep beside her. Trembling with relief and love, she leaned closer, and a drop of hot oil fell from her lamp onto his shoulder, waking him instantly. Betrayed by her broken trust, Eros fled, and the enchanted palace vanished with him, leaving Psyche alone and grieving on bare ground. Determined to win him back, Psyche wandered the earth searching for Eros, eventually throwing herself on Aphrodite's mercy, who assigned her a series of seemingly impossible tasks, every bit as punishing as anything Eurystheus had devised for Heracles, sorting an enormous mixed pile of grains before nightfall, accomplished only with the secret help of an army of ants, gathering wool from violent, sun-scorched golden sheep, managed by waiting until evening when the animals grew calm. Fetching water from a treacherous, dragon-guarded spring, aided by an eagle sent by Zeus himself, and finally, descending into the underworld itself to bring back a portion of Persephone's own beauty sealed in a box, with strict instructions never to open it. Psyche's curiosity, as fatal to her as it had been to Pandora generations before, got the better of her on the journey back, and she opened the box, only to find it contained not beauty but a deathly sleep that overcame her instantly. Eros, whose love had never truly faded despite his anger, found her there, lifeless on the road, and gently wiped the sleep from her eyes, then flew to Olympus and begged Zeus to intervene. Zeus, moved by the devotion the young god showed, granted Psyche immortality outright, welcoming her formally among the gods and finally silencing Aphrodite's objections to the match. Psyche and Eros married properly this time, in the full light of Olympus rather than hidden in darkness, and had a daughter together whom they named Hedone, pleasure itself, one of the rare unions in this entire mythology allowed, after every trial imaginable, to end in something like uncomplicated joy. In the city of Argos, a king named Acrisius received a prophecy that chilled him to the bone. His own grandson, a child not yet even conceived, would one day kill him. Desperate to escape a fate that had already claimed so many other kings and fathers throughout these stories, Acrisius locked his daughter Danae away in a bronze chamber, sealed off from any man who might father the child the prophecy warned him about. It was not another man who found his way to her. Zeus, taking the form of a shower of golden light, slipped through the chamber's defenses and appeared to Danae, and from that union came a son, Perseus. Acrisius, discovering the child, could not bring himself to kill his own daughter and grandson outright, but he could not risk keeping them close either. He sealed them both inside a wooden chest and set it adrift on the open sea, leaving their survival to fate rather than his own hand. A distinction that mattered a great deal to men trying to avoid the guilt of a prophecy while still trying to escape it. The chest washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where a kind fisherman named Dictys found them and took them in, raising Perseus as his own. Perseus grew into a strong and capable young man, and it might have stayed a quiet, unremarkable life if not for Dictys' brother, Polydex, the island's king, who developed an unwelcome interest in Danae and saw her grown son as an obstacle standing between them. Polydex devised a plan to be rid of Perseus honorably, announcing a great feast where every guest was expected to bring a gift. And knowing Perseus had nothing to offer, he baited the young man into rashly promising anything the king desired, up to and including the head of Medusa, the only mortal among three monstrous sisters known as the Gorgons, whose gaze turned any living creature to stone. It was, by any reasonable measure, a death sentence dressed up as a challenge, but Perseus had helped few mortals could claim. Athene, for reasons the myths attribute to her own complicated relationship with Medusa. Some versions describe Medusa as once a beautiful priestess in Athene's temple, transformed into a monster by the goddess after Poseidon assaulted her there. A punishment that fell entirely on the victim rather than the perpetrator guided Perseus toward the tools he would need. Hermes provided winged sandals, allowing him to fly. Hades' helm of invisibility rendered him unseen. A reflective bronze shield from Athene let him view Medusa's reflection rather than her direct, petrifying gaze, and a special sword and pouch completed the arsenal. Perseus first had to track down the three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and single tooth between them, passing it back and forth. He snatched the eye mid-exchange and refused to return it until they told him where to find the nymphs who could arm him further, forcing cooperation through sheer cleverness rather than brute strength. When he finally reached the Gorgon's lair, he approached with his eyes fixed only on his polished shield, watching Medusa's reflection rather than risking a direct look. And as she slept, he struck, severing her head in a single stroke while her sisters, immortal and enraged, woke too late to stop him. From her severed neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior wielding a golden sword, both born strangely from her union with Poseidon that had led to her curse in the first place. Perseus fled with Medusa's head sealed in his pouch, still deadly even severed from her body. On his journey home, flying above a rocky coastline, Perseus spotted a young woman named Andromeda chained to a cliff, offered as a sacrifice to a sea monster after her mother had foolishly boasted that Andromeda's beauty surpassed that of the sea nymphs, an insult Poseidon had punished by sending the beast to terrorize her kingdom. Perseus, using Medusa's head to turn the monster to stone, saved her, and the two married, beginning a partnership that would outlast nearly every other romance in Greek mythology for its relative stability and happiness. Returning at last to Seriphos, Perseus found his mother still fending off the unwanted advances of Polydex. He strode into the king's court, and when Polydex mocked him for supposedly failing his impossible quest, Perseus revealed Medusa's head, turning the king and his entire court to stone in an instant. Dictys, the kind fisherman who had raised him, was made ruler of the island in Polydex's place, and Perseus, his mother finally safe, prepared to return to Argos. He never intended to fulfill the old prophecy, but fate in these stories rarely cares what anyone intends. Years later, competing in athletic games in a distant city, Perseus threw a discus that veered off course in the wind and struck an elderly spectator in the crowd, killing him instantly. The old man was Acrisius, his grandfather, who had fled Argos years earlier, still trying to outrun the very prophecy that had just found him anyway, in the one place he thought a stray discus could never reach. No hero in Greek mythology looms larger than Heracles, and few were born into more trouble before they had even drawn their first breath. His mother, Alcmene, was a mortal woman of extraordinary virtue, married to a general named Amphitryon. Zeus, taken with her, disguised himself as her husband while the real Amphitryon was away at war, and in that deception fathered a son destined for greatness. When the real Amphitryon returned, and eventually the truth came out, Alcmene found herself carrying twins, one fathered by Zeus, one by her mortal husband, a tangled parentage that would define the hero's entire existence. Zeus, proud of the son about to be born, made an announcement to the gods that the next child born of his bloodline that day would become a great king, ruling over all his kin. Hera, hearing this and recognizing exactly whose birth Zeus was celebrating, moved with characteristic ruthlessness. She delayed Alcmene's labor and at the same time hastened the birth of another child in Zeus's line, a boy named Eurystheus, born prematurely but born first, technically fulfilling the letter of Zeus's proclamation and installing Eurystheus, not Heracles, as the king whose commands Heracles would one day be forced to obey. Heracles, whose name itself meant something close to glory of Hera, a bitter irony given how the goddess would spend his entire life trying to destroy him, was finally born, along with his mortal twin, Iphicles. Hera's hatred did not wait long to make itself known. When Heracles was still an infant in his crib, she sent two enormous serpents to kill him in the night. Iphicles screamed in terror at the sight of them. Heracles, barely old enough to sit up, simply reached out with a strength no infant should possess and strangled both serpents with his bare hands, an early and unmistakable sign of exactly what kind of being he would grow into. He grew into a man of monstrous, almost incomprehensible strength. Trained by the finest teachers in every discipline, archery, wrestling, swordsmanship, even music, though his temper made that particular education end badly when he struck and killed his music tutor in a fit of frustration. He married Megara, a princess, and for a time it seemed as though his life might settle into something resembling peace. Hera would not allow it. She struck Heracles with a fit of madness so complete and so violent that in the depths of it, he no longer recognized his own wife and children, seeing only enemies where his family stood. By the time the madness lifted and his vision cleared, he found himself standing amid a devastation he had caused with his own hands, his children, and in some versions his wife as well, dead by his own strength, killed in a rage he had no memory of and could never fully forgive himself for. Heracles was consumed by horror and guilt. He sought purification and eventually traveled to the oracle at Delphi to ask how he might atone for what Hera's curse had driven him to do. The oracle's answer would define the rest of his life. He was to serve his cousin, King Eurystheus, the very man whose birth Hera had engineered to steal Heracles' birthright, for 12 years, performing whatever tasks the king demanded of him. Only then would he be cleansed of his guilt. Eurystheus, resentful of Heracles' strength and fame, and likely no small amount of fear at having a demigod bound in his service, devised a series of labors intended to be not just difficult, but outright impossible, expecting Heracles to die attempting at least one of them. The first was the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide was so tough that no blade, arrow, or spear could pierce it. Heracles tracked the creature to its lair, discovered that ordinary weapons were useless against it exactly as warned, and instead wrestled the lion with his bare hands, eventually strangling it to death. He skinned the lion using its own claws, the only thing sharp enough to cut its impenetrable hide, and wore the pelt as armor for the rest of his life, its head serving as a kind of helmet, becoming the visual signature by which the hero would be recognized for the rest of mythology. Next came the Lernaean Hydra, a many-headed serpent whose breath alone was poisonous, and whose most terrifying trait was regeneration. Sever one head, and two would grow back in its place. Heracles fought the creature alongside his nephew Iolaus, and when he discovered that simply hacking at the heads only made the problem worse, the two devised a solution together. As Heracles severed each head, Iolaus would immediately cauterize the wound with a burning torch, preventing new heads from sprouting. The Hydra's one immortal head, once severed, was buried beneath a heavy boulder, ensuring it could never rise again. Heracles dipped his arrows in the creature's poisonous blood, a decision that would return with devastating consequences much later in his life. The remaining labors stretched his strength and cunning in every possible direction. He captured the Cyrenian hind, a deer sacred to Artemis so swift that chasing it directly proved useless, forcing Heracles into a year-long pursuit before he finally cornered it. He trapped the Erymanthian boar alive by driving it into deep snow. He cleaned the Augean stables, filled with the waste of thousands of cattle, uncleaned for years, not with a shovel, but by diverting the course of 2 entire rivers to wash the filth away in a single day, a solution as clever as it was audacious. He drove off the Stymphalian birds, monstrous creatures with bronze beaks and metallic feathers. They could fire like arrows, using bronze castanets forged by Hephaestus to startle them into flight so he could shoot them down. He captured the Cretan bull, tamed the man-eating mares of Diomedes by feeding their cruel owner to them, retrieved the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, a task that turned violent only after Hera, disguised, spread false rumors among the Amazons that Heracles intended to kidnap their queen, sparking a battle that need never have happened at all. He drove off the cattle of the monstrous three-bodied giant Gion, traveling to the very edge of the known world to do it, and along the way set up 2 great pillars at the straits separating Europe from Africa, landmarks that the ancient world came to call the Pillars of Heracles. He stole golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, guarded by a 100-headed dragon, tricking Atlas, still condemned to hold up the sky from the war against the Titans, into fetching the apples himself, while Heracles held the heavens in his place, then cleverly talking his way out of holding that burden permanently once Atlas returned. And in the final and most harrowing labor, he descended into the underworld itself and captured Cerberus, the 3-headed hound guarding its gates, wrestling the monstrous dog into submission with nothing but his bare hands and armor, then hauling it up to the mortal world to show Eurystheus before returning it safely to its post. 12 labors, each one intended to break him, and Heracles completed every single one. Even his years of servitude did not end cleanly with the 12th labor. In a fit of madness inflicted on him once more, this time for murdering a friend in a rage he could not later explain even to himself, Heracles was sentenced by the oracle to a further year of servitude, sold as a slave to Omphale, queen of Lydia, who kept him dressed in women's clothing and set him to spinning wool alongside her handmaidens while she wore his lion's skin and wielded his club herself, a humbling reversal that later artists found endlessly fascinating to depict. The mightiest man alive reduced, for a single year, to entertainment at a foreign queen's court. It was also during this same restless period of his life that Heracles first came to Troy, long before the war that would one day destroy the city. King Laomedon, Priam's own father, had once cheated the gods Apollo and Poseidon out of payment for building the city's walls, and as punishment, Poseidon sent a sea monster to terrorize the coastline, demanding the sacrifice of Laomedon's own daughter, Hesione, to appease it. Heracles arrived in time to save her, striking a bargain with Laomedon for a set of magnificent horses in exchange for killing the beast, only to have Laomedon cheat him out of payment exactly as he had cheated the gods before him. Furious, Heracles gathered an army, returned years later, sacked Troy in a much smaller preview of the devastation the city would eventually suffer at Greek hands a second time, and killed Laomedon and all his sons but one, the youngest, spared and ransomed, who grew up to rule Troy under new name, Priam, the very king whose reign, and whose son Paris's fateful choice on a mountainside, would one day bring an even larger Greek army back to finish what Heracles had started. His life after the labors was no less eventful, filled with further adventures, further marriages, further tragedies. He fought alongside the gods against the rebelling giants, joined the crew of the Argo on part of their famous voyage, and eventually remarried a woman named Deianira. It was this marriage that led indirectly to his death. A centaur named Nessus, attempting to abduct Deianira, was killed by one of Heracles's poisoned arrows, tipped, still, with the venom of the long-dead Hydra. Dying, Nessus told Deianira that his blood, if smeared on a garment, could be used to guarantee Heracles's eternal faithfulness, a lie meant as a final act of revenge from beyond the grave. Years later, fearing she was losing her husband's affection to another woman, Deianira remembered the centaur's words and soaked a robe in his tainted blood, sending it to Heracles as a gift. The moment he put it on, the Hydra's poison, still lethal even generations after the beast's death, began to burn through his skin, an agony so complete that not even his monstrous strength could withstand it. Unable to remove the robe, which had fused to his flesh, and facing a death slower and more horrifying than any monster had ever managed to inflict on him, Heracles chose to end his suffering himself, building his own funeral pyre and climbing onto it. As the flames consumed his mortal body, the divine half of him, inherited from Zeus, rose up to Olympus, where he was finally welcomed among the gods as an immortal, reconciled at last, in most versions of the story, with the very goddess whose hatred had shaped and haunted nearly every chapter of his extraordinary life. In Trojan, a young man named Theseus grew up not knowing his father's identity. His mother, Aethra, had been visited by both a mortal king, Aegeus of Athens, and the sea god Poseidon in the same night, leaving Theseus's true parentage tangled between the divine and the human, much like Heracles before him. Before leaving Trojan, Aegeus had hidden a sword and a pair of sandals beneath an enormous boulder, telling Aethra that if she bore a son strong enough to move the stone, she should send him to Athens with those tokens to be recognized as his heir. When Theseus came of age, he lifted the boulder with ease and set off for Athens, choosing deliberately to travel by the dangerous land route rather than the safer sea route, seeking out trouble along the way in a clear bid to build a reputation to rival the great Heracles, whom he openly admired. The road was infested with bandits and monsters who had terrorized travelers for years, and Theseus dispatched each one using a method that mirrored the villain's own cruelty. The bandit Procrustes, who had made a grim habit of forcing travelers onto an iron bed, stretching those who were too short and cutting down those too tall to fit, met exactly that fate under Theseus's hand. Arriving in Athens, Theseus found the city gripped by political scheming. Aegeus had since taken up with the sorceress Medea, who recognized Theseus immediately as a threat to her own son's claim to the throne and convinced Aegeus, still unaware of who this stranger truly was, to poison the newcomer at a feast. Only at the last moment, as Theseus drew the sword his father had left for him years before to cut his meat, did Aegeus recognize the blade and knock the poisoned cup from his son's hands just in time, banishing Medea and finally welcoming Theseus as his heir. But Athens itself was under a terrible burden. Years earlier, the city had gone to war with Crete and lost, and as part of the humiliating peace terms, Athens was required to send 7 young men and 7 young women every 9 years as tribute, sacrificed to a monster called the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, born from a union between the Cretan queen Pasiphae and a magnificent bull that Poseidon had sent as a punishment against her husband, King Minos, for failing to properly honor the sea god with a promised sacrifice. The Minotaur was imprisoned within an elaborate maze called the Labyrinth, designed by the brilliant craftsman Daedalus, specifically so complex that no one who entered could ever hope to find their way back out. When the time came for the next tribute, Theseus volunteered himself as one of the 14, determined to end the horror once and for all over his father's desperate objections. He promised that if he succeeded and survived, his ship would return flying white sails instead of the black ones it always carried on this grim voyage, so his father would know from a distance whether his son still lived. In Crete, Minos's daughter Ariadne fell for Theseus the moment she saw him, and unwilling to watch him walk to his death in the labyrinth, she secretly gave him a ball of thread, instructing him to tie one end at the entrance and unspool it as he went deeper, so he could retrace his path back out. Theseus entered the maze, navigated its winding corridors with Ariadne's thread trailing behind him, found the Minotaur at its center, and killed it in a brutal struggle. Some versions say with his bare hands, others with a sword smuggled in for the purpose. Following the thread back to the entrance, he gathered the other tribute and Ariadne herself and fled Crete before Minos could stop them. What followed cast a long shadow over Theseus's reputation. On the island of Naxos, during their journey home, Theseus abandoned Ariadne while she slept, sailing away without her for reasons the ancient sources never fully agree on. Some claim the god Dionysus demanded her for himself and appeared to Theseus in a vision. Others suggest simple ingratitude or forgetfulness on Theseus's part. Whatever the cause, Ariadne woke alone on a beach, betrayed by the man she had saved, though most versions grant her a happier ending than her abandonment suggested, as Dionysus found her there and made her his bride. And in his grief or distraction over the whole ordeal, Theseus forgot the one promise that mattered most to his father. He failed to change his ship's sails from black to white. Aegeus, watching from a clifftop for his son's return, saw the black sails approaching, and believing Theseus dead, threw himself into the sea in despair. That body of water has carried his name ever since, the Aegean Sea, a permanent monument to one careless oversight amid a hero's triumphant return. Theseus became king of Athens in his father's place, and under his rule, according to tradition, the scattered villages of Attica were unified into a single city-state, a political achievement the Athenians would credit to him for centuries. But his personal life continued to be marked by the same recklessness that had defined his youth, a disastrous second marriage to Phaedra, Ariadne's own sister, which ended in tragedy when Phaedra, spurned by Theseus's son from a previous relationship, falsely accused the young man of assault, leading Theseus to curse his own son to death before learning, too late, that the accusation had been a lie. He fought alongside Heracles and other legendary figures throughout his life, battled the Amazons, and even ventured, in one final act of reckless ambition, into the underworld itself in an attempt to help a friend abduct Persephone, an offense against Hades so severe that Theseus found himself trapped there, bound to a chair of forgetfulness, until Heracles, passing through on his final labor, freed him and returned him to the world above, though not without lasting cost. His later years brought him little of the glory his youth had promised. Athens grew restless under changing leadership, and Theseus, aging and increasingly out of favor, was eventually driven from the city he had unified, dying in exile on the island of Skyros, pushed from a cliff by a king who either feared him or resented his continued influence. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for a man who had once walked willingly into a monster's maze. A reminder, echoed throughout Greek mythology again and again, that even the greatest heroes rarely got to choose how their own stories ended. The mortal world, watching all of this unfold from far beneath Olympus, eventually found its own way to honor the heroes and gods whose stories had shaped it so completely, and nowhere was that reverence expressed more enduringly than at Olympia, in the valley where, according to tradition, Heracles himself first paced out the length of a running track and established athletic games in honor of his own father, Zeus, after completing his labors. Every 4 years, the story went, warring city-states across the Greek world agreed to a sacred truce, laying down their weapons long enough for athletes to gather and compete in foot races, wrestling, boxing, and chariot racing, each contest framed not merely as sport, but as a kind of living tribute to the gods who had first modeled excellence, competition, and glory for mortals to imitate. A winner's prize was often nothing more than a simple wreath of olive leaves, the same tree Athene had once used to win the patronage of her city, a reminder that the honor itself, not material wealth, was considered the truest reflection of divine favor. Perseus, whose story of Medusa and Andromeda had launched the great age of heroes decades before Heracles was even born, lived out his own remaining years with a good fortune rare among this mythology's protagonists. Rather than reclaiming the throne of Argos his grandfather Acrisius had once occupied, a throne he now technically stood to inherit despite having killed the old king by accident, Perseus, uneasy about ruling a kingdom haunted by that death regardless of how unintentional it had been, arranged an exchange of kingdoms with a neighboring ruler instead, and settled in Tiryns, where he founded the great city of Mycenae, its walls, according to legend, built with the help of the very Cyclopes, whose stonework was said to be so massive that only giants could have lifted it into place. It was this same city of Mycenae, founded by Perseus in a rare moment of hard-won peace, that would one day become the seat of Agamemnon's power, the very palace from which the largest fleet in Greek history would eventually set sail for Troy, closing a circle between the mythology's earliest heroic triumph and the war that would come, generations later, to define its final and bloodiest chapter. Other heroes of that same restless age left behind stories just as strange, just as instructive, and just as unwilling to grant their subjects a simple happy ending. There was Bellerophon, a young prince who, after accidentally killing his own brother, sought purification in the court of King Protus, only to be falsely accused by the king's wife of assaulting her when he refused her advances. Unwilling to kill a guest under his own roof and break the sacred laws of hospitality, Protus instead sent Bellerophon to his father-in-law with a sealed letter, unaware that the young man carried, without knowing it, the very instructions for his own execution. The father-in-law, reluctant to murder guests directly himself, set Bellerophon a task he assumed was equally fatal: slay the Chimera, a fire-breathing monster with the body of a lion, a goat's head rising from its back, and a serpent for a tail, a creature no warrior had ever managed to defeat. Bellerophon succeeded where the task was designed to fail, aided by Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's severed neck years earlier, whom Bellerophon managed to tame with a golden bridle gifted to him by Athene in a dream. Flying above the Chimera's reach, he was able to strike it down from the air, embedding a lump of lead on his spear that melted in the creature's own fiery breath and choked it from within. He went on to complete further impossible tasks, defeating a tribe of fierce warrior women and surviving an ambush, until the king, recognizing that the gods clearly favored this young man, gave up trying to have him killed and instead welcomed him as a son. Bellerophon's story, however, did not end in triumph. Flush with his victories and his winged mount, He grew arrogant enough to attempt something no mortal had any right to attempt, flying Pegasus up to Olympus itself, believing his deeds had earned him a seat among the gods. Zeus, unwilling to tolerate such presumption, sent a single gadfly to sting Pegasus mid-flight, and the horse reared in pain, throwing Bellerophon back down to earth. He survived the fall, but broken, lamed, and blinded by the ordeal, he spent the remainder of his life wandering alone, avoided by other men, a warning about the particular danger of believing one's own glory entitles a mortal to more than mortals are given. In Athens, meanwhile, the brilliant craftsman Daedalus, the same man who had built the labyrinth to contain the Minotaur, found himself trapped by his own creation. King Minos, furious that Daedalus had helped Theseus and Ariadne defeat the Minotaur and escape the maze, imprisoned Daedalus and his young son, Icarus, within a tower, determined that the one man who knew the labyrinth's secrets would never share them with anyone else again. Daedalus, ever inventive, refused to accept the imprisonment as final. He gathered feathers shed by the seabirds that nested near the tower and bound them together with wax, fashioning two enormous sets of wings, one for himself and one for his son, intended to let them fly free over the sea that Minos's ships could never hope to patrol completely. Before they leapt from the tower, Daedalus gave his son a single, urgent warning: fly a middle course, neither too low, where the sea's damp air would weigh down the feathers, nor too high, where the sun's heat would melt the wax holding them together. At first the escape went exactly as planned, father and son soaring together over the waves, farther and farther from Crete with every passing moment. But Icarus, drunk on the exhilaration of flight and the freedom of the open sky, forgot his father's warning entirely. He climbed higher and higher, reveling in how close he could get to the sun, until the wax sealing his wings together softened, then melted, and the feathers began to scatter around him one by one. He plummeted into the sea below, and by the time Daedalus, searching frantically and calling his son's name, realized what had happened, there was nothing left to find but feathers floating on the water. The sea where he fell has carried the boy's name ever since, the Icarian Sea, one more permanent scar left on the map by a single moment of mortal overreach. A different kind of hero entirely was Atalanta, abandoned on a mountainside as an infant by a father who had wanted a son, and raised instead by a she-bear until hunters found her and took her in, teaching her to run and hunt with a skill that would eventually surpass every man who challenged her. She joined the famous hunt for the Caledonian boar, a monstrous beast sent by Artemis to ravage the countryside of Caledon after its king neglected to include her in his annual sacrifices, drawing nearly every great hero of the age to the hunt, Atalanta among them. It was her arrow that drew the first blood from the boar, and the hunt's leader, Meleager, smitten with her, insisted she receive the prize of the boar's hide despite grumbling from the other men, unwilling to be shown up by a woman, a decision that led to a bitter feud among the hunters, and eventually to Meleager's own death at his own mother's hand, in a grim twist tied to a magical log that governed the length of his life. Burned by his mother in fury over the deaths of her brothers in the resulting quarrel. Atalanta, having sworn never to marry unless a suitor could outrun her in a foot race, with death as the price of losing, turned away every hopeful challenger, easily outpacing them all and watching each one executed for the failure, until a young man named Hippomenes, aided by Aphrodite, devised a clever solution. The goddess gave him 3 golden apples from her own sacred garden, and as Atalanta gained on him during the race, he dropped them one at a time, letting her irresistible curiosity slow her down each time to scoop one up, until his trick finally let him cross the finish line first. They married, though their story, too, ended badly. In their passion, they made love in a sacred temple, an act so disrespectful to the god who owned it that they were transformed into lions as punishment, condemned, according to ancient belief, never to mate with their own kind again. And there was Orpheus, son of a muse, whose music was said to be so extraordinarily beautiful that it could charm wild animals into peaceful stillness, coax trees to bend toward him, and even persuade rivers to pause their flow to listen. He fell deeply in love with a nymph named Eurydice, and their marriage seemed to promise the kind of happiness so rare in these stories, until, on their wedding day itself, Eurydice, fleeing the unwanted advances of another man, stepped on a venomous snake and died from its bite before Orpheus could reach her. Grief-stricken beyond anything his music had ever expressed before, Orpheus made a decision no mortal had seriously attempted before him. He descended into the underworld itself to plead for his wife's return, and his song, carrying every ounce of his sorrow, was said to move even Hades and Persephone, the two beings least inclined toward mercy in the entire cosmos, to tears. They agreed to release Eurydice back to the world of the living, on one single, absolute condition. Orpheus must walk ahead of her the entire way back to the surface, and he must not look back to confirm she was following until they had both fully emerged into daylight. The climb back was long, silent, and agonizing, Orpheus straining to hear footsteps behind him that never quite confirmed themselves over the darkness and echo of the passage. As he finally stepped out into the light himself, doubt overtook him in the last possible instant. Had she truly been following? Had Hades tricked him after all? And he turned back to look, just a moment too soon, while Eurydice's own feet had not yet crossed the threshold. She was pulled back into the darkness instantly, her final word to him not anger, but a soft, resigned farewell, gone now for a second, and truly final time. Orpheus spent the rest of his life in mourning, his music turned entirely to grief, until he met his own end torn apart by a group of frenzied women, his severed head still singing, according to legend, as it floated down the river, carried out to sea, still calling Eurydice's name long after there was nothing left of him to grieve with. Not every encounter between gods and mortals ended in tragedy, punishment, or transformation as a curse. In the hill country of Phrygia, Zeus and Hermes once traveled the earth in mortal disguise, testing the hospitality of the people they passed, and were turned away from door after door until they reached the humble cottage of an elderly couple, Baucis and Philemon, who had almost nothing to offer but welcomed the two strangers in without hesitation, sharing what little food and wine they had with a warmth that never once wavered even as the wine cup, unbeknownst to them, refilled itself miraculously again and again throughout the meal. Recognizing their divine guests at last, and terrified they had offered too little, the elderly couple offered to sacrifice the single goose that guarded their home, only for the gods to stop them, moved by a generosity that had nothing to do with wealth. Zeus led the couple to a hilltop and showed them their entire village, flooded and destroyed as punishment for every household that had refused them shelter, their own small cottage the sole structure left standing, transformed before their eyes into a magnificent temple. Granted a single wish, Baucis and Philemon asked only to serve as priests of that temple together for the rest of their lives, and to die at exactly the same moment, so that neither would ever have to bury or mourn the other. The gods granted it, and when their time finally came many years later, the two were transformed together into a pair of intertwined trees growing from a single trunk outside the temple doors, still standing together in death exactly as they had stood together in life. Aphrodite herself was not immune to devastating loss in matters of the heart, despite being the very goddess of love. She fell for a beautiful mortal youth named Adonis, born of a scandalous union between a Cyprian princess and her own father, after a curse from Aphrodite herself had driven the girl to it. A curse the goddess came bitterly to regret once she saw the child that resulted from it, and fell in love with him herself. She warned Adonis repeatedly against hunting dangerous game, fearful for his safety in a way she had never felt about any other lover. But Adonis, headstrong and unable to resist the thrill of the chase, ignored her warnings and was gored fatally by a wild boar. Some versions claiming the beast was sent by a jealous Ares, furious at losing Aphrodite's affection to a mortal rival. Aphrodite reached him only in time to hold him as he died, and from his blood mixed with her tears sprang the anemone flower, delicate and short-lived, blooming briefly each spring before scattering its petals to the wind, exactly as fleeting as the boy it had grown from. Apollo, too, lost a beloved companion to sudden and senseless tragedy. Hyacinthus, a Spartan prince of extraordinary beauty, became Apollo's closest companion, the god teaching him music, archery, and the discus throw, delighting in his company more than in almost any other relationship across his long existence. During a friendly contest of discus throwing between the two of them, a gust of wind, sent, in some versions, by the jealous west wind Zephyrus, who also loved Hyacinthus and could not bear to watch him favor Apollo instead, caught the discus mid-flight and drove it into the young man's skull, killing him instantly in front of the god who loved him. Apollo, refusing to let death claim him entirely, transformed Hyacinthus's spilled blood into a new flower bearing his name, its petals said to be marked with a pattern resembling a mournful sigh, blooming each spring as a permanent, living reminder of a single careless gust of wind and a friendship cut tragically short. In the kingdom of Iolcus, a usurper named Peleus had seized the throne from his own half-brother, Aeson, whose infant son was smuggled away to safety and raised in secret by the wise centaur Chiron, a teacher who would go on to mentor an entire generation of Greek heroes from a cave on Mount Pelion. That child grew up to be Jason, and when he was ready, he returned to Iolcus to reclaim what had been stolen from his family. On his way into the city, Jason came to a river swollen and dangerous, and there he found an old woman struggling to cross. Without hesitation, he carried her over on his back, not realizing she was the goddess Hera in disguise, testing the character of the young man she had decided to favor. Hera held a particular grudge against Peleus, who had neglected to honor her properly, and she saw in Jason a useful instrument for the usurper's downfall. In the crossing, Jason lost one of his sandals to the river's current, and he arrived in Iolcus wearing only one. Peleus, seeing the young man approach with a single bare foot, felt a chill of recognition. An old prophecy had warned him to beware a man wearing only one sandal. Rather than confront Jason outright, Peleus devised a plan meant to be just as fatal as Eurystheus's labors had been for Heracles. He would grant Jason the throne, he said, if the young man could first bring back the golden fleece, a legendary treasure guarded in the distant land of Colchis, at the very edge of the known world, by a dragon that never slept. Jason accepted and set about assembling a crew worthy of such an impossible voyage. What followed was a gathering of nearly every great hero and demigod of that generation, Heracles himself, though he departed partway through the journey. Orpheus, the legendary musician whose songs could calm storms and soothe sailors' fears. Atalanta, the swift huntress, the twins Castor and Pollux, and dozens of others, all crewing a ship called the Argo, built specifically for the voyage and blessed with a plank from a sacred, prophetic oak that could occasionally speak and offer guidance. The journey to Colchis tested the Argonauts again and again. They stopped on the island of Lemnos, where the women had killed nearly every man among them and welcomed the crew with open arms, delaying the voyage for months before the Argonauts finally continued on. They battled the Harpies, monstrous bird-women tormenting the blind prophet Phineus by fouling every meal set before him, and in gratitude for driving the creatures away, Phineus told them how to survive the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, two massive cliffs that slammed together to crush any ship attempting to pass between them. Following his advice, they released a dove first to gauge the timing, then rode through the narrow gap with everything they had the instant the rocks began to part again, losing only a piece of their stern ornament as the cliffs snapped shut behind them. At last they reached Colchis, ruled by King Aeetes, who possessed the Golden Fleece, but had no intention of simply handing it over. He set Jason a series of trials nearly as brutal as Heracles' labors, yoking fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves to plow a field, sowing the field with dragon's teeth that sprouted instantly into an army of armed warriors, and surviving the encounter that followed. Jason might have died there if not for Medea, Aeetes' own daughter, and a powerful sorceress in her own right, who fell deeply in love with him. Some versions say the goddess Aphrodite arranged it deliberately, sending Eros to strike her with an arrow of desire the moment Jason arrived. Medea gave him a protective ointment to withstand the bull's fire and instructed him, when the army of warriors sprang from the sown teeth, to throw a single stone into their midst, setting the warriors against each other in confused combat rather than facing their full number alone. Jason completed the trials, but Aeetes, furious and humiliated, refused to honor his word and began plotting to destroy the Argonauts outright. Medea, choosing Jason over her own father, betrayed her family entirely, leading Jason to the grove where the fleece hung guarded by the sleepless dragon, and using her sorcery to lull the beast into an enchanted slumber long enough for Jason to seize the golden prize. Their escape was no less desperate than the trials that preceded it. Aeetes pursued them with his fleet, and in the most disturbing act of the entire saga, Medea is said to have brought her own younger brother along on the escape, and when her father's ships drew too close, killed him and scattered pieces of his body into the sea behind them, forcing Aeetes to slow his pursuit to gather his son's remains for proper burial, buying the Argo the time it needed to escape, at a cost that would haunt every account of Medea's character from that point forward. The voyage home brought further trials. The deadly song of the sirens narrowly survived only because Orpheus's own music was beautiful enough to drown theirs out before the crew could be lured to their deaths. A passage guarded by Talos, an enormous bronze automaton who patrolled the shores of Crete, defeated when Medea used her magic to work loose the single bolt sealing the vital fluid that kept him animated. Returning at last to Iolcus with the fleece in hand, Jason found that Peleus had never intended to honor their bargain either, having in the meantime driven Jason's agging father to his death. Medea, ever resourceful and ever ruthless, offered to help. She demonstrated to Peleus's own daughters a magical rejuvenation, cutting apart an old ram and boiling it in a cauldron of herbs, from which a young lamb miraculously emerged, and convinced the daughters that the same process could restore their agging father's youth. They did as she instructed, cutting Peleus apart themselves and placing him in the cauldron, only for no miracle to follow, no herbs added that could ever have worked. It had been Medea's revenge from the start, and Peleus's own children had unknowingly become the instrument of his death. Jason and Medea, now infamous rather than celebrated for how the throne had finally been claimed, were driven from Iolcus and settled eventually in Corinth, where they had children together and lived for years in relative peace, a peace that shattered completely when Jason, drawn by ambition, abandoned Medea to marry the daughter of the Corinthian king instead, believing he could better secure his family's future through the new match. Medea's response became one of the most devastating acts of vengeance in the entire body of Greek mythology. She sent a poisoned robe and crown as a wedding gift to Jason's new bride, killing her and her father in agony when they put them on, and then, in the myth's darkest turn, killed her own 2 children by Jason as well, ensuring that his betrayal cost him everything he had left, rather than only what he had chosen to give up. She escaped Corinth in a chariot drawn by dragons, sent by her grandfather, the sun god Helios, leaving Jason alone with nothing, no wife, no children, no throne, and no fleece worth the ruin it had ultimately brought him. He lived out the remainder of his life, a broken and largely forgotten man. The most famous account of his death carries a certain bitter poetry to it. Years later, resting in the shade of the now rotting Argo, the ship that had carried him to glory in his youth, its decaying stern ornament broke free and fell, crushing him where he sat, killed at last by the very ship that had once made him a legend. Long before that curse took root, the city of Thebes itself had to be built, and its founding began, fittingly enough, with another of Zeus's schemes. He noticed a Phoenician princess named Europa gathering flowers near the shore and transforming himself into a magnificent white bull, gentle and beautiful enough that she eventually climbed onto his back out of simple curiosity, carried her out to sea and across the water to Crete, where he revealed his true identity and fathered several children with her, including Minos, the very king whose labyrinth and minotaur would one day entangle Theseus. Europa's father, distraught at his daughter's disappearance, sent his sons out in every direction to find her, forbidding them from returning empty-handed. One of those sons, Cadmus, searched for years without success and eventually consulted the oracle at Delphi, who told him to abandon the search entirely. His sister was beyond finding, and instead follow a specific cow he would encounter on the road, building a city on the exact spot where the animal finally lay down to rest. Cadmus did as instructed, and when the cow finally stopped in a fertile valley, he prepared to offer it in sacrifice to Athene, sending his companions to fetch water from a nearby spring. The spring, however, was guarded by a monstrous serpent sacred to Ares, which killed every man Cadmus sent, until Cadmus himself confronted and slew the creature. Athene then instructed him to sow the serpent's teeth into the ground, and from that soil sprang a crop of fully armed warriors, who immediately began fighting one another in a frenzy until only 5 remained. These 5 survivors, rather than posing a threat, became Cadmus's most loyal companions and the ancestors of Thebes's noblest families, the city itself rising on the very spot where the serpent had fallen. Cadmus ruled well and married Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, in a wedding so splendid that the gods themselves attended and brought gifts, though one of those gifts, a cursed necklace, would go on to bring misfortune to nearly everyone who ever wore it in the generations that followed. Cadmus and Harmonia's own later years were marked by grief as their children met one misfortune after another, until finally, worn down by the losses within their own family, the 2 elderly rulers were transformed into serpents themselves and allowed to live out eternity together, quietly, far from the throne and the sorrows that had come with it. Their descendants did not fare much better. Cadmus's grandson, Actaeon, met the horrific fate of being torn apart by his own hounds after glimpsing Artemis bathing. Another grandson, Pentheus, inherited the Theban throne and made the fatal mistake of refusing to acknowledge Dionysus as a true god, banning worship of him within the city. An insult the wine god answered personally, driving the women of Thebes, including Pentheus's own mother, into an ecstatic, god-maddened frenzy in the mountains outside the city. Pentheus, spying on their rites in disguise, was spotted, mistaken by his own frenzied mother for a wild animal, and torn limb from limb by her hands before her madness lifted and she realized, holding her own son's severed head, exactly what she had done. And there was Niobe, another of Cadmus's descendants and queen of Thebes, whose downfall came from a pride any reader of these stories by now would recognize as fatally familiar. Blessed with 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, Niobe boasted publicly that she was more worthy of worship than the Titaness Leto, who had only ever borne two, Apollo and Artemis. Leto, deeply insulted, sent her two children to punish the insult in the most devastating way imaginable. Apollo cut down every one of Niobe's sons with his arrows, and Artemis did the same to her daughters, until every single one of Niobe's 14 children lay dead, and Niobe herself, consumed by a grief too immense for any human body to contain, was transformed into a weeping stone, a mountain face from which water still trickles down like endless tears, a permanent monument to the cost of boasting louder than the gods could tolerate. It was into this same city, generations later, still carrying the weight of Cadmus's cursed founding and Pentheus's and Niobe's devastating falls, that Laius would eventually take the throne, the king whose own choices and whose own son's unwitting return would finally bring the House of Thebes to its bitter and complete conclusion. Before the story of Greek mythology could turn toward its most famous war, one more tragedy needed to unfold, a curse laid on a royal house in the city of Thebes that would produce one of the most haunting stories mortals ever told about themselves. King Laius of Thebes received a prophecy that his own son would grow up to kill him and marry his own mother. Horrified, Laius and his wife Jocasta had the infant's ankles pierced and bound together, and ordered a servant to leave him exposed on a mountainside to die, a common and brutal method of disposing of unwanted children in these stories. The servant, unable to go through with it fully, instead handed the child to a shepherd, who carried him to Corinth, where the childless king and queen there adopted him and raised him as their own, naming him Oedipus, swollen foot, a permanent reminder of the wound from his abandonment. Oedipus grew up believing the king and queen of Corinth were his true parents, and it was only as a young man, taunted by a drunken acquaintance about not truly belonging to his own family, that he sought out the oracle at Delphi for the truth. The oracle gave him no comfort. Instead, it told him the same prophecy that had haunted his birth parents. He was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified and believing the king and queen of Corinth were the parents in question, Oedipus fled the city immediately, determined never to return and never to let the prophecy come true. On the road at a narrow crossroads, his chariot nearly collided with another, and a violent argument over the right-of-way escalated into a full fight. Oedipus, in his fury, killed the older man riding in the other chariot, never realizing, and having no way to realize, that the man he had just killed was Laius, his true father, on the exact crossroads the prophecy had been quietly working toward all along. Continuing on toward Thebes, Oedipus found the city terrorized by the Sphinx, a monster with the body of a lion and the face of a woman, who blocked the road and killed every traveler unable to answer her riddle. Oedipus alone solved it. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening, was man himself, crawling as an infant, walking upright in the prime of life, and leaning on a cane in old age, and the Sphinx, defeated, threw herself from her perch to her death. Grateful, the city of Thebes, now leaderless after their king's mysterious death on the road, offered Oedipus the throne and the hand of the recently widowed queen Jocasta, his own mother, though neither of them knew it. The prophecy, which Oedipus had fled Corinth specifically to avoid, had come true in every detail, achieved through the very act of running from it. Years passed. Oedipus and Jocasta ruled Thebes together and had 4 children, until a terrible plague began ravaging the city, and the oracle revealed that it would not lift until Laius's true killer was found and punished. Oedipus, determined and unaware he was investigating his own crime, pursued the truth relentlessly, piece by piece, testimony by testimony, until the full horror of his own identity finally became impossible to deny. Jocasta, realizing the truth first, hanged herself rather than live with what she now understood. Oedipus, discovering her body and grasping the complete horror of everything he had unknowingly done, tore the pins from her robe and used them to blind himself, unable to bear the thought of ever looking upon the world or his own children again. He spent his remaining years wandering in exile, guided by his devoted daughter Antigone, a broken king carrying a curse he had done everything in his power to escape. That curse did not end with him. His sons, Eteocles and Polynices, agreed to share the throne of Thebes by ruling in alternating years, but Eteocles refused to step down when his turn ended, driving Polynices into exile and setting off a war, the famous conflict of the Seven against Thebes, that ended with the brothers killing each other in single combat outside the city gates, each one dying by the other's hand, the family's curse finally exhausting itself in mutual destruction. The House of Thebes had paid, generation after generation, for a prophecy no one had ever managed to outrun. And elsewhere in the Greek world, at almost the same span of mythological time, a very different chain of events was quietly gathering, one that would begin, as so many disasters in this mythology did, with a wedding, an uninvited guest, and a golden apple inscribed with a single word that would eventually set an entire civilization ablaze. That other chain of events carried its own inherited curse, stretching back generations before Troy to a mortal king named Tantalus, a son of Zeus who had once been welcomed to dine at the gods' own table on Olympus, an honor almost no mortal was ever granted. Tantalus repaid that honor with one of the most grotesque betrayals in the entire mythology, wanting to test whether the gods truly saw everything or perhaps simply to prove his own cleverness. He killed his own son, Pelops, cooked him, and served the flesh to the gods at a banquet in his own home. Every god at that table recognized the horror on their plates immediately and refused to touch it, except Demeter, still so consumed by grief over her missing daughter Persephone that she absent-mindedly ate a portion of the boy's shoulder before anyone stopped her. The gods restored Pelops to life, reassembling him and replacing the missing shoulder with one carved from ivory, and turned their fury on Tantalus himself, condemning him to an eternity in the underworld, standing in a pool of water beneath fruit-laden branches, tormented for all time by hunger and thirst that could never be satisfied. Every time he reached for the fruit above him, the branches pulled just out of reach, and every time he bent to drink, the water receded before it could touch his lips, an eternal, exquisitely cruel punishment that gave the world the very word for being tantalized. Pelops grew up carrying the shadow of his father's crime, and in time fathered two sons of his own, Atreus and Thyestes, whose rivalry would carry the family's curse forward into a new and even bloodier generation. The two brothers competed savagely for the throne of Mycenae, and Thyestes, discovering that Atreus's wife had fallen for him, seduced her and conspired to steal the kingdom for himself. When Atreus eventually regained the throne and uncovered the full extent of his brother's betrayal, his revenge surpassed even their grandfather's original horror. He murdered Thyestes' own young sons, cooked them, and served them to their unknowing father at a supposed reconciliation feast, revealing the severed hands and heads only after Thyestes had already eaten, a cruelty so extreme that the sun itself was said to have reversed its course across the sky in horror rather than witness it. Thyestes, cursing his brother's entire bloodline in his grief and rage, fathered one final son through his own daughter on the advice of an oracle seeking vengeance, a child named Aegisthus, raised solely to one day kill Atreus and settle the family's endless cycle of betrayal once and for all. Atreus's own sons, meanwhile, inherited both the throne and the curse hanging over it, Agamemnon, who would one day command the entire Greek fleet against Troy, and Menelaus, whose wife's abduction would give him the cause to gather that fleet in the first place. It was this same doomed bloodline, carrying violence and betrayal in its blood across 4 generations already, that Agamemnon belonged to when he made the fateful choice at Aulis to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, for a favorable wind. And it was that same family curse, waiting patiently in the background of the entire Trojan War, that would ensure Agamemnon's own homecoming ended in murder rather than triumph, at the hands of a wife who had never forgiven him, aided by a lover, Aegisthus, who had been raised from birth for exactly that purpose. The gods had not stopped meddling in mortal affairs, and nowhere would that meddling prove more catastrophic than at the wedding of a sea nymph named Thetis to a mortal king named Peleus. It was, on the surface, a celebration nearly every god and goddess on Olympus attended, drawn by a match significant enough that Zeus himself had once desired Thetis, only to withdraw his interest after a prophecy warned that any son born of her would grow to surpass his father, whoever that father happened to be. Marrying her off to a mortal, instead, conveniently ensured that whatever remarkable child she bore would never threaten the throne of Olympus. One goddess was pointedly left off the guest list, Eris, goddess of discord, whose presence at any gathering tended to end badly for everyone involved. Furious at the snub, she arrived anyway uninvited and rolled a golden apple into the middle of the feast, inscribed with a single phrase, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately laid claim to it: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athene, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. None of them would yield, and the argument grew heated enough that even Zeus, usually eager to settle disputes among his family, wanted no part of choosing a favorite among these 3 particular women and risked the wrath of the 2 he didn't pick. Instead, the judgment was handed to a mortal, a young Trojan prince named Paris, currently living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, having been exposed as an infant after prophecy warned that he would bring about the destruction of Troy, and then rescued and raised by shepherds unaware of his royal blood. Hermes brought the 3 goddesses before him, and each one, rather than relying on beauty alone, attempted to bribe him outright. Hera offered him power, kingship over all of Asia. Athene offered him wisdom and unmatched skill in battle. Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the entire world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and in doing so, made an enemy of 2 of the most powerful goddesses in existence, a decision that would cost his entire city everything, though he could not have known it at the time. Helen's own birth carried the same unmistakable signature of Zeus's wandering attention that marked so many of the era's most consequential figures. Her mother, Leda, queen of Sparta, had caught the king of the gods' eye, and Zeus, in one of his stranger disguises, approached her in the form of a swan seeking shelter from a pursuing eagle. From that encounter, and in the same night according to most versions, from her union with her own mortal husband, King Tyndareus, Leda produced children hatched from eggs rather than born in the usual way, among them Helen, whose beauty from birth carried a divine radiance no mortal parentage alone could have produced, along with her brothers Castor and Pollux, who would themselves go on to sail with Jason among the Argonauts. By the time she came of age, Helen's beauty had already become the stuff of legend across the Greek world, drawing suitors from every kingdom eager to claim her hand, each one arriving with gifts and armies of attendants, each one increasingly aware that whichever man Tyndareus finally chose risked provoking a war among all the men left disappointed. It was Odysseus, already known even then for his cleverness, who proposed the solution that would later doom him to fight in the very war it was meant to prevent. Every suitor would swear a binding oath to defend the marriage of whichever man Helen chose, no matter who that man turned out to be, ensuring that any future threat to her marriage would be met not by one husband alone, but by the united strength of every kingdom in Greece. Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, and it was that same oath, sworn in good faith years before Paris ever set foot in Sparta, that would soon summon an entire civilization to war. The most beautiful woman in the world, as it turned out, was already married. Helen, daughter of Zeus and considered the most beautiful mortal woman alive, was wife to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Aphrodite, honoring her promise regardless of the inconvenient detail of Helen's marriage, arranged for Paris to travel to Sparta as a guest, where Helen, whether through the goddess's influence, genuine infatuation, or some combination of both, that the ancient sources never fully untangle, left with him for Troy, either willingly or abducted, depending on which version of the myth one chooses to believe. Menelaus, discovering his wife gone and his hospitality betrayed in the worst possible way, called on every Greek king and warrior bound by an old oath, sworn years earlier by every one of Helen's original suitors, under the guidance of the clever Odysseus, to defend the marriage of whichever man she eventually chose. And one by one, the great kingdoms of Greece answered the call. Menelaus's brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and by far the most powerful ruler among them, took command of the assembled army, determined to sail against Troy and reclaim Helen by force if necessary. Some of the greatest heroes of the age had to be persuaded or tricked into joining. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had heard a prophecy that if he went to Troy, he would not return home for 20 years, and tried to avoid the summons by feigning madness, ploughing his fields with salt instead of seed. The trick was exposed when Palames, sent to fetch him, placed Odysseus's infant son directly in the path of the plough. A father genuinely mad would have ploughed straight through his own child, but Odysseus swerved instantly to avoid him, revealing the deception and forcing his hand. Achilles, son of that same sea nymph Thetis and the mortal Peleus, was hidden away by his mother on the island of Skyros, disguised among the king's daughters, because Thetis knew a prophecy foretold that her son would either live a long, quiet, unremarkable life, or a short one blazing with glory and eternal fame, and she desperately hoped to steer him toward the former by keeping him from the war entirely. Odysseus, sent to find him, arrived at the court disguised as a merchant and laid out a collection of jewelry and fine cloth alongside a sword and shield, then had his men sound an alarm as though the palace were under attack. While the actual princesses fled in panic, the disguised Achilles instinctively reached for the weapons, revealing exactly who he was and sealing his fate to join the expedition, glory over safety, exactly as the prophecy had warned. The Greek fleet gathered at Aulis, thousands of ships strong, but found itself stranded there for weeks by winds that refused to blow in the direction they needed. The prophet Calchas revealed the reason. Agamemnon had angered the goddess Artemis, in some versions by boasting he was a better hunter than she was, and the only way to appease her and free the winds was an almost unthinkable sacrifice, Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon, torn between his role as a father and his role as commander of the largest army Greece had ever assembled, ultimately chose the fleet. Iphigenia was summoned to Aulis under the pretense of marrying Achilles himself, only to discover, on arrival, the truth of why she had really been brought there. In most versions, she was sacrificed on the altar, though a gentler telling claims Artemis, moved by pity at the final moment, swapped the girl for a dear and spirited Iphigenia away to serve as a priestess in a distant land, leaving the Greeks to believe the sacrifice had been completed. Either way, the winds shifted, and the fleet finally set sail for Troy, carrying with it a father's guilt that would poison his own household for years to come, long after the war itself was finished. Not every casualty of the war fell to an enemy blade. Palames, the same clever Greek who had exposed Odysseus's feigned madness at the very start of the expedition, by placing his infant son in the path of the plough, earned Odysseus's lasting enmity for that exposure, and Odysseus, patient and unforgiving in equal measure, eventually orchestrated his revenge. He forged a letter, supposedly from the Trojan king Priam, addressed to Palames and thanking him for his treachery, then buried gold beneath Palames's tent to match the letter's claims of payment, and arranged for both to be discovered by the other Greek commanders. Convinced of Palames's guilt despite his desperate protests of innocence, the army stoned him to death, and the war lost one of its most brilliant strategic minds to nothing more than one man's grudge, a stain on the Greek cause that some later poets treated as a greater crime than anything the actual Trojans ever did to provoke the war in the first place. The war that followed lasted 10 long years, though most of the stories that survive focus on events crowded into just its final weeks. In the war's later stages, Odysseus and Diomedes carried out one of its boldest and most quietly consequential raids, slipping into the Trojan camp under cover of darkness after capturing and interrogating a Trojan spy who revealed the location of Rhesus, a Thracian king who had just arrived to reinforce Troy along with magnificent horses said to be prophesied as capable of guaranteeing Troy's survival if they ever grazed on Trojan soil or drank from the local river. Odysseus and Diomedes crept into the sleeping Thracian camp, slaughtered Rhesus and a dozen of his men where they lay, and drove the prized horses back to the Greek lines before the camp even realized it had been infiltrated, denying Troy both a valuable ally and the prophecy that might have saved it. When Achilles was finally laid to rest after his death at Paris's hand, the Greeks held funeral games in his honor every bit as elaborate as the ones he himself had once organized for Patroclus' chariot races, wrestling matches, foot races, and contests of archery and spear throwing, the assembled heroes competing for prizes drawn from Achilles' own considerable plunder, a celebration of a fallen warrior's life carried out with the same competitive intensity that had defined the war itself. Grief and glory tangled together in exactly the way this entire mythology so often insisted they belonged. The arrival of the Amazon queen Penthesilea, mentioned briefly in the chaos following Hector's death, deserves its own fuller telling, for she came to Troy's aid leading a company of the fiercest warrior women the Greeks had ever faced, seeking not just to help a beleaguered ally, but in some tellings, to find a kind of purification after accidentally killing her own sister during a hunt. She fought with a skill that stunned even the hardened Greek veterans, cutting down warrior after warrior before finally meeting Achilles himself in single combat, a duel that ended, as so many of Achilles' duels did, in the death of a magnificent opponent whose loss he seemed to mourn even as his own hand had caused it. Troy itself, ruled by the Aegean king Priam and defended by his son Hector, a warrior as honorable and beloved by his people as Paris, the cause of it all, was reckless and self-absorbed, proved far too well fortified and well defended to fall quickly. The Greeks settled into a long siege, raiding the surrounding countryside and towns for supplies and plunder, while the main conflict ground on with no clear end in sight. It was a dispute over plunder, in fact, that triggered the central crisis of the entire war. Agamemnon had claimed a captive woman, Chryseis, as part of his share of spoils, and when her father, a priest of Apollo, begged for her return and was refused, he prayed to his god for vengeance. Apollo answered by sending a plague through the Greek camp, and when Achilles called an assembly to address the disaster, the prophet Calchas revealed the cause, forcing Agamemnon to give the girl back to end the plague. Humiliated in front of the entire army, Agamemnon retaliated by seizing Briseis, a captive woman who had been given to Achilles as a mark of honor, asserting his authority as commander, even as it meant deliberately provoking the single deadliest warrior in his own army. Achilles was not the only Greek warrior whose battlefield exploits became legendary in their own right. During the early stretch of the war before Achilles' withdrawal reshaped everything, Diomedes, king of Argos, experienced a single day of fighting so extraordinary that later poets gave it its own name, an Aristeia, a warrior's shining hour of unmatched glory. Blessed by Athene with strength and courage beyond his usual measure, and with his sight sharpened so he alone could distinguish gods from mortals moving among the armies, Diomedes cut through the Trojan ranks with a ferocity that sent even seasoned warriors fleeing before him. When Aphrodite descended to the battlefield to rescue her mortal son Aeneas, a Trojan prince and one of the city's finest fighters, from Diomedes' spear, the Greek warrior did something no mortal had ever dared attempt before. He pursued the goddess herself across the field and wounded her hand with his blade, drawing not blood, but the pale, luminous ichor that flowed through divine veins instead. Aphrodite fled the battlefield in pain and humiliation, mocked afterward by her own siblings on Olympus for a wound sustained trying to protect a mortal rather than presiding properly over her own domain of love. Diomedes, emboldened rather than chastened by the encounter, went on that same day to wound Ares himself, the god of war, when Ares intervened directly in the fighting on the Trojan side. A spear thrust, guided by Athene's own hand, that sent the war god shrieking back to Olympus in a cry so loud it was said to match the sound of 10,000 men on a battlefield at once. Complaining to Zeus about the injury, while his father coldly reminded him that he had always been the most hateful of all the Olympians precisely because he loved conflict for its own sake. Achilles' fury was total. He withdrew from the fighting entirely, refusing to lend his strength or his men to the Greek cause any longer, and prayed to his mother Thetis to intercede with Zeus on his behalf, asking that the Trojans be allowed to push the Greeks back toward their ships and suffer devastating losses, so that Agamemnon would come to understand just how badly he needed the warrior he had insulted. Zeus, who owed Thetis a favor from an earlier act of loyalty, agreed. With Achilles absent, the war turned decisively against the Greeks. Hector led the Trojans in a series of brutal victories, driving the invaders back toward their beached ships and setting fire to them, threatening to end the entire war in a single overwhelming push, while the greatest Greek warrior sat in his tent, arms crossed, refusing to lift a spear no matter how desperate his own countrymen's pleas became. It was Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, bound to him by a friendship the ancient sources describe with a depth and intimacy that later generations would interpret in different ways. But that was, in every telling, the single most important relationship in Achilles' life, who finally could not bear to watch the slaughter any longer. He begged Achilles to at least let him wear Achilles' own armor and lead his soldiers back into the fight, hoping the mere sight of that armor would be enough to convince the Trojans that Achilles had returned and send them fleeing in panic. Achilles agreed, but with one crucial condition. Patroclus was to drive the Trojans back and then withdraw, never pressing the attack all the way to Troy's walls himself. Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor, tore through the Trojan ranks exactly as hoped, turning the tide of battle and driving the enemy back in terror. But caught up in the momentum of victory, he ignored Achilles' warning and pressed on toward the city itself. And there, on the battlefield outside Troy's walls, he met Hector. The god Apollo, favoring the Trojans in this encounter, struck Patroclus from behind, stunning him and stripping away his armor's protection at the crucial moment. And Hector, seeing his chance, delivered the killing blow. When word reached Achilles that Patroclus was dead, killed while wearing his own armor, something in him broke entirely. His grief was described in the old sources as almost inhuman in its intensity. He tore at his hair, threw himself on the ground, and his cries were said to have reached his mother even in the depths of the sea. Thetis, unable to ease his sorrow, could at least arm him properly again, and she went to Hephaestus, who forged a new set of armor for Achilles overnight, shield included, decorated with scenes depicting the whole of human life, war and peace both, a masterpiece crafted in a single night for a man about to use it to bring nothing but devastation. Achilles returned to the war not for Greece, not for Agamemnon, not even fully for glory anymore, but purely for vengeance. He reconciled with Agamemnon just long enough to rejoin the fight, and then tore through the Trojan ranks with a fury that bordered on the divine, killing so many men and choking the nearby river with so many bodies that the river god himself rose up in fury to fight Achilles directly, only to be beaten back by Hephaestus's fire at Hera's urging. Eventually, Achilles found Hector himself outside the walls of Troy. Every other Trojan had retreated inside the city gates, but Hector, urged by his own sense of duty and shamed by his father Priam's desperate pleading from the walls to come inside, stood his ground alone. As Achilles approached, however, even Hector's courage faltered, and he turned and ran, with Achilles pursuing him 3 full times around the city's walls before the goddess Athene, disguised as Hector's own brother, tricked him into finally standing and fighting, promising falsely that she would fight alongside him. The duel ended exactly as Hector, abandoned by the god he thought was fighting beside him, must have feared it would. Achilles drove his spear through a gap in Hector's armor, delivering a fatal wound, and Hector, dying, begged that his body be returned to his family for proper burial rather than left for the dogs and birds. Achilles refused, coldly, still consumed entirely by grief and rage over Patroclus, and after Hector died, he lashed the body to his chariot by the ankles and dragged it in the dirt around the walls of Troy, in full view of the grieving city, for days on end. Long before that final reconciliation, during the darkest days of Achilles' withdrawal from the fighting, Agamemnon had tried once already to win him back, sending Odysseus, the elder warrior Phoenix, and the towering Ajax to Achilles' tent with an offer of staggering wealth: gold, captive women, cities, even Agamemnon's own daughter in marriage, if only Achilles would set aside his anger and rejoin the war. Achilles, still burning over the insult of Briseis' seizure and unmoved even by riches on that scale, refused them all, declaring that no treasure was worth more than his own life, and that he would rather sail home and live a long, quiet existence than die at Troy chasing glory for a commander who had disrespected him so openly. It was only Patroclus's death, not Agamemnon's gold, that would eventually succeed where the embassy had failed. The war also could not be won, a prophecy eventually revealed, without the help of a bow left behind at the very start of the expedition: Philoctetes, a skilled archer entrusted with the great bow of Heracles himself, a gift given to him by the dying hero in gratitude for lighting his funeral pyre when no one else could bear to, had been bitten by a venomous snake on the way to Troy, and the wound had festered into something so foul-smelling and his cries of pain so constant and unbearable that the Greek commanders, unable to stand it any longer, abandoned him on the deserted island of Lemnos and sailed on without him. He survived there alone for 10 years, nursing his wound and his fury at the men who had left him to rot. Late in the war, a captured Trojan prophet revealed that Troy could never fall without that same bow of Heracles fighting on the Greek side, forcing Odysseus and Achilles' own son, Neoptolemus, summoned to the war after his father's death, to sail back to Lemnos and somehow convince the bitter, betrayed archer to forgive the very men who had abandoned him and rejoin a war he had every reason to want no part of. Through a mixture of manipulation, sincere persuasion, and eventually the intervention of Heracles' own spirit urging him toward glory, Philoctetes agreed, and his wound, finally properly treated by the Greek healers, closed at last. He went on to kill Paris himself with an arrow from that same legendary bow, avenging in one stroke both his own 10 years of abandonment and the war's original cause. It took an extraordinary act of courage to finally end the desecration. King Priam, guided secretly by Hermes past the Greek camp's defenses under cover of night, entered Achilles' own tent alone and unarmed, knelt before the man who had killed so many of his sons, and kissed the hands that had killed Hector, begging for his son's body back. Something in that act, an old king humbling himself completely, reminding Achilles of his own father far away, finally broke through the wall of grief and vengeance Achilles had built around himself. He wept alongside Priam, the two of them mourning together, enemy and enemy, father and killer, and Achilles agreed to release Hector's body, even granting a truce so the Trojans could hold a proper funeral for their greatest defender. Achilles himself did not have long left to live, though his own death takes place after the events described in the oldest surviving account of the war, preserved instead in later poems and traditions that filled in what came next. More Trojan allies arrived to bolster the city's defenses. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, fought and fell at Achilles' hand, and in the moment he removed her helmet to see the face of the warrior he had just killed, he was struck by her beauty and in some tellings fell into a grief and regret so sharp it bordered on love for an enemy he had only just slain. Memnon, a king from the east and son of the dawn goddess Eos, arrived to fight for Troy as well, and he too fell to Achilles, his mother's tears afterwards said to fall to earth every morning as dew. Achilles' own death came not on the open battlefield but through treachery, fittingly delivered by the very prince whose selfish choice had started the entire war. Paris, guided by Apollo's own hand according to most versions, fired an arrow that struck Achilles in the one vulnerable point on his entire body, his heel, the single spot his mother Thetis had missed when she dipped him as an infant into the river Styx to make him invulnerable, holding him by that heel as she did it. The wound was fatal, and the greatest warrior of the entire war died on the plains outside Troy, his body recovered from the field only after a fierce fight over his corpse. His armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, became the subject of a bitter dispute between two of the remaining Greek heroes, Ajax, a warrior of towering size and strength, and Odysseus, whose cunning had proven itself invaluable time and again throughout the siege. When the Greek leaders voted to award the armor to Odysseus, favoring his wit over Ajax's brute strength, Ajax's pride could not survive the humiliation. Driven half-mad with rage and shame, he set out in the night to murder the Greek commanders who had slighted him, only for the goddess Athene, protecting Odysseus, to cloud his mind and cause him to slaughter a flock of livestock instead, believing them to be his enemies. When dawn broke and Ajax realized what he had actually done, and what a fool the entire army now saw him, as he could not bear the disgrace, and fell on his own sword in despair. With Achilles gone and Troy's walls still unbroken after a full decade of siege, it was Odysseus who finally devised the strategy that would end the war. The Greeks built an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside, and concealed a small group of their best warriors within it, while the rest of the army burned their camp and appeared to sail away entirely, leaving behind only the horse and a single soldier, Sinon, instructed to let himself be captured and to spin a convincing lie. Sinon told the Trojans that the horse was an offering to Athene, built specifically too large to fit through the city gates, so that the Trojans could never bring it inside and claim its protective blessing for themselves. It was, of course, exactly the kind of reverse psychology designed to guarantee the opposite outcome. Some among the Trojans were suspicious. The priest Laocoon warned outright against trusting the gift, famously declaring that he feared Greeks even when they came bearing gifts, and hurled a spear into the horse's flank to prove his point, only for two enormous serpents to rise from the sea moments later and crush him and his sons to death in full view of the city, a horror the Trojans interpreted as divine punishment for doubting the horse rather than a warning against dragging it inside. Convinced by Sinon's lies and shaken by Laocoon's grisly fate, the Trojans tore down a section of their own wall to bring the horse inside the city, celebrating late into the night with a victory they believed was finally, truly theirs after 10 impossible years. When the city had drunk itself into exhausted sleep, the hidden Greek warriors climbed down from inside the horse, opened the gates from within and signaled the fleet, which had only sailed a short distance away and now returned under cover of darkness. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. Troy, caught completely off guard, fell in a single night of fire and slaughter. King Priam was killed at his own household altar. Astyanax, Hector's infant son, was thrown from the city walls to prevent him from ever growing up to avenge his father and reclaim the throne. Cassandra, Priam's daughter, cursed by Apollo to speak true prophecies that no one would ever believe, a punishment inflicted after she refused his advances, had warned of exactly this outcome for years, ignored every single time, and was dragged from the temple of Athene and taken as a captive. The city that had withstood a decade of siege burned to the ground in a matter of hours, its walls torn down, its people killed or enslaved, its name reduced from a great and wealthy civilization to a cautionary legend almost overnight. Helen, the woman whose face had launched the entire catastrophe, was reunited with Menelaus amid the ruins. Accounts differ on whether he intended to kill her on the spot for her betrayal or was disarmed entirely by the sight of her beauty. But in most tellings, the two eventually returned together to Sparta and resumed their marriage as though a decade of war and death could simply be set aside. The surviving Greek heroes turned for home, expecting after 10 years of siege to finally return to the lives, families, and kingdoms they had left behind. For most, that homecoming came quickly, if not always happily. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered in his own bath by his wife Clytemnestra, who had spent the entire war nursing her own fury over the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis, and who had taken a lover in his absence to help finish the job. Agamemnon's murder did not end the story of his cursed household. His son, Orestes, still a child when his father was killed, was smuggled away to safety by a loyal servant before Clytemnestra and Aegisthus could eliminate every rival claim to the throne, and he grew up in exile, nursing a grief and a duty that would eventually consume him. The god Apollo himself commanded Orestes to avenge his father's murder, and years later, Orestes returned to Mycenae in disguise, and with the help of his devoted sister Electra, killed both Aegisthus and his own mother in payment for what they had done, a matricide that, however justified by the demands of vengeance and divine command, immediately summoned the Furies, those same ancient spirits born from Uranus's spilled blood at the very beginning of this entire mythology, who existed for exactly this purpose, punishing those who spilled the blood of their own kin. Driven half-mad by the Furies' relentless pursuit, Orestes wandered for years seeking purification, eventually standing trial in Athens itself, in a court established by Athene specifically to resolve the impossible question his case represented. Was matricide in service of avenging a father's murder a crime deserving eternal punishment, or a debt properly paid? The jury split evenly, and Athene herself cast the deciding vote in Orestes' favor, finally breaking the cycle of vengeance that had plagued the house of Atreus across 5 devastating generations. From Tantalus's original horror through Pelops, Atreus and Thyestes, Agamemnon, and now, at last, Orestes, whose acquittal closed a wound in that bloodline that violence alone had never once managed to heal. Remarkably, Orestes' own sister, Iphigenia, spared at the altar at Aulis all those years earlier, according to the gentler tradition, and spirited away by Artemis to serve as a priestess among a distant, foreign people, would eventually cross paths with her brother one final time. Orestes, still seeking further purification for his mother's murder, was sent by Apollo to retrieve a sacred statue from the very temple where Iphigenia now served, unaware his own long-lost sister was its priestess. The two recognized each other just before Iphigenia, following the customs of her adopted land, would have been forced to sacrifice her own brother without knowing it, a near tragedy mirroring in its own way, the sacrifice that had once nearly claimed her own life. Together, brother and sister escaped, carrying the sacred statue back to Greece, closing out the house of Atreus's long and blood-soaked story with something Tantalus's original crime had never once allowed any of his descendants, an ending built on recognition and rescue rather than betrayal and revenge. But for one hero, the man whose cunning had finally broken Troy's walls, the journey home would prove to be its own decade-long odyssey, filled with monsters, temptations, and trials that would test him just as thoroughly as any battlefield ever had. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, set sail from the ruins of Troy with 12 ships and a fleet of men who had survived a decade of the bloodiest war their world had ever known, expecting a straightforward voyage home. Ithaca lay only a matter of days across open water. It would take him 10 more years to reach it, and by the time he did, he would return alone, having lost every single man who sailed with him. The trouble began almost immediately, with Odysseus's own decision to raid the land of the Cicons on his way home, a plundering expedition that went well at first, but ended in a costly counterattack that cost him several men before he could get his ships back out to sea. A storm afterward blew his fleet badly off course, far from any route home, and it was this storm, as much as any monster or curse to follow, that truly set the tone for the wandering, punishing journey ahead. They came next to the land of the lotus eaters, where the local plant, once eaten, filled a person with such total contentment and forgetfulness that they lost all desire to ever leave again. Several of Odysseus's men, sent ashore to gather supplies, ate the lotus, and had to be dragged back to the ships in tears, weeping to be freed from the paradise of forgetting, tied to the rowing benches until the drug's effects finally wore off. Their next landfall proved far more dangerous. They came ashore on an island inhabited by the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants of enormous strength, and Odysseus, driven by curiosity and a hope of hospitality gifts, led a small party into the cave of one of them, Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon himself, a detail that would prove disastrous for the entire rest of the voyage. Polyphemus returned to find strangers in his cave, sealed the enormous entrance with a boulder no ordinary man could move, and rather than offering hospitality, began eating Odysseus's men 2 at a time, crushing them and devouring them raw in full view of their terrified companions. Trapped with no way to move the boulder themselves, Odysseus devised a plan. He offered Polyphemus strong, undiluted wine he had brought from the ship, and the giant, delighted and unaccustomed to anything so potent, drank himself into a heavy stupor, first asking Odysseus his name. Odysseus, ever cunning, answered nobody, a small deception that would prove to be the entire key to their escape. As Polyphemus slept, Odysseus and his remaining men heated a sharpened wooden stake in the fire and drove it into the giant's single eye, blinding him. Polyphemus's screams brought other Cyclopes to the cave entrance, asking who had hurt him, and when he answered, "Nobody has hurt me," by cunning rather than force, they assumed he was speaking metaphorically about the gods, or simply unwell, and left without investigating further, leaving Odysseus's ruse to finish exactly as he'd hoped. The blinded giant, still guarding his cave's entrance by feeling for anyone trying to slip past him, could not stop Odysseus's men from escaping by clinging to the underside of his own sheep as they were let out to graze each morning, Polyphemus running his hands only along their backs, never underneath. As they finally sailed away, Odysseus, unable to resist a final boast, shouted back across the water and revealed his true name, a moment of pride that would cost him dearly, because Polyphemus, now able to properly curse his tormentor, prayed to his father Poseidon for vengeance, asking that Odysseus be denied his homecoming for as long as possible, and if he did return, that he arrive alone, having lost all his men on a stranger's ship, to find nothing but trouble waiting for him. Poseidon heard every word of it. They found brief hope with Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who gave Odysseus a gift meant to speed his journey, a leather bag containing every unfavorable wind sealed tightly inside, leaving only the gentle breeze needed to carry them straight home. They came within sight of Ithaca itself, close enough to see smoke rising from its hearths, when Odysseus's exhausted crew, suspecting the sealed bag held hidden treasure their commander was hoarding from them, opened it while he slept. The winds roared out all at once, and the resulting storm blew them entirely back to Aeolus's island, who, now believing the gods themselves must be against this cursed traveler, refused to help him a second time. Worse followed at the island of the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibalistic giants who hurled boulders down on Odysseus's fleet from cliffs above their harbor, smashing 11 of his 12 ships to splinters and killing nearly every man aboard them before they could even escape the bay. Only Odysseus's own ship, which he had wisely kept moored outside the harbor rather than inside with the rest of the fleet, survived to sail on, now carrying only a fraction of the men who had left Troy with him. With one battered ship remaining, Odysseus's crew landed on the island of Aea, home to the sorceress Circe, whose beautiful voice they heard drifting from her halls as she wove at her loom. A scouting party went ashore to investigate, and Circe welcomed them warmly, offering food and wine laced with enchantment that transformed every man who ate it into a pig, trapping them in her sty along with the rest of her transformed prisoners. Only one man escaped to warn Odysseus, Eurylochus, who had grown suspicious and refused to enter Circe's hall in the first place. Odysseus set out alone to rescue his men, and on the way, the god Hermes appeared to him and provided a protective herb called moly, warning him that it alone would let him resist Circe's magic. When Circe's enchanted wine had no effect on him and Odysseus, following Hermes's further instructions, drew his sword and threatened her directly, she recognized him immediately as the one man fated to withstand her power, and rather than fighting further, she yielded, restoring his men to their human forms and inviting the entire crew to stay as honored guests rather than prisoners. They remained on Aea for a full year, recovering from the ordeal of their journey, before Odysseus's men finally convinced him it was time to continue home. Circe, before releasing them, gave Odysseus crucial guidance for the trials still ahead, including an instruction he could never have anticipated needing, that he must first sail to the edge of the world and enter the underworld itself, to consult the shade of the blind prophet Tiresias about the path home. In the land of the dead, Odysseus performed the ritual Circe had described, and the spirits of the departed gathered around the blood of his sacrifice, eager for a taste that would let them speak again. Tiresias warned him of the dangers still to come, particularly regarding the cattle of the sun god on the island of Thrinacia, and told him that if his men touched those sacred animals, none of them would survive to see home. Odysseus also spoke there with the shade of his own mother, who had died of grief waiting for his return, and with fallen companions from Troy, Agamemnon, who warned him bitterly about the dangers of trusting a wife too completely after his own murder at Clytemnestra's hands, and Achilles, who offered comfort about his glorious death and eternal fame, answered instead that he would rather be a poor, living servant on earth than a king among all the dead. Odysseus also glimpsed, from a distance, the punishment still being carried out on some of the underworld's most notorious sinners, a grim gallery of consequences that Greek storytellers loved to return to whenever they wanted to remind an audience exactly what awaited those who crossed the gods too boldly. He saw Tantalus, still standing eternally in his pool beneath the ever-retreating fruit, condemned to that same maddening hunger and thirst generations after his crime against his own son. Nearby, Sisyphus, a cunning and famously deceitful king of Corinth, who had twice managed to cheat death itself, once by tricking the very personification of death into his own chains, and again by convincing Hades to let him briefly return to the world of the living to scold his wife, only to simply refuse to come back at all until he was forcibly dragged down again, labored eternally at a punishment tailored precisely to his arrogance. He pushed an enormous boulder up a steep hill, and every single time he neared the top, exhausted and triumphant, the boulder slipped from his grasp and rolled back down to the bottom, forcing him to begin the exact same climb all over again. Forever, a punishment so perfectly, hopelessly repetitive that it eventually lent its name to any task that offers the illusion of progress toward a goal that can never actually be reached. There was also Ixion, bound to a wheel of fire and spun endlessly through the sky, punished for having attempted to seduce Hera herself after Zeus had shown him extraordinary mercy for an earlier crime, tricked by Zeus into embracing a cloud shaped like the goddess rather than Hera herself. Ixion had still boasted of the conquest anyway, a betrayal of trust so brazen that Zeus's leniency evaporated instantly. And there were the 50 Danaids, daughters of a king who had ordered them to murder their husbands on their wedding night to avoid a prophecy, 49 of whom obeyed, condemned now to spend eternity trying to fill a great jar with water using vessels riddled with holes, watching the water drain away before it could ever accumulate to anything. An endless, futile labor matched to the endless, futile violence of the crime that had earned it. Returning to the world of the living, Odysseus and his crew faced the trial of the sirens next, creatures whose enchanting song lured sailors to steer their ships onto the rocks and their deaths. Forewarned by Circe, Odysseus had his men plug their own ears with wax so they could not hear the song at all, while he alone, curious to experience it and survive, had himself bound tightly to the mast, ordering his men to ignore any pleas he made to be released, no matter how desperately he begged once the song began. The sirens' voices proved every bit as irresistible as promised, and Odysseus strained against his ropes and screamed to be freed, but his men, deaf to both the song and his cries, rowed on without slowing, and the ship passed safely out of range. Scylla had not always been a monster. Long before Odysseus's ship ever approached her strait, she had been a beautiful sea nymph, admired by a fisherman-turned-minor sea god named Glaucus, who begged the sorceress Circe for a potion to win the nymph's affection. Circe, who had fallen for Glaucus herself the moment she saw him, offered her own love instead, and when Glaucus refused her in favor of Scylla, Circe's jealousy curdled into vengeance. Rather than harming Glaucus directly, she poisoned the very waters where Scylla bathed, and the beautiful nymph emerged transformed into a horror of snarling dog heads and serpentine limbs, so revolted by her own reflection that she flung herself into the strait between Italy and Sicily and remained there ever after, her rage at what had been done to her curdling, over the centuries, into the same predatory violence she now inflicted on any ship unfortunate enough to pass within her reach. The very ship Odysseus and his remaining men now approached, guided by Circe's own warning about the monster her own jealousy had helped create in the first place. Immediately after came one of the cruelest choices of the entire voyage, a narrow strait guarded on one side by Scylla, a six-headed monster who would snatch and devour sailors from a passing ship, and on the other by Charybdis, a massive whirlpool capable of swallowing an entire vessel whole. There was no way to avoid both. Circe had advised Odysseus to sail closer to Scylla, accepting the loss of 6 men, one for each of her heads, rather than risk his entire ship and crew to Charybdis's more absolute destruction. Odysseus, unable to bring himself to warn his men and watch them row in terror instead of at full strength, kept the choice to himself, and as they passed through the strait, Scylla struck exactly as Circe had warned, snatching 6 sailors screaming from the deck, their cries the last Odysseus would hear from them as the ship sailed on without them. The survivors landed next on Thrinacia, the island of the sun god's sacred cattle, and Odysseus, remembering both Circe's and Tiresias's warnings, made his men swear a solemn oath never to touch the animals grazing there, planning only to pass through briefly for supplies. But adverse winds trapped them on the island for a full month, their provisions dwindling to nothing, and one day, while Odysseus slept, his starving and desperate men broke their oath and slaughtered several of the sacred cattle for a feast, reasoning that they would rather face a god's fury with full stomachs than certain starvation with empty ones. The sun god Helios, discovering the slaughter of his sacred herd, appealed to Zeus for justice, threatening to take his light down to the underworld and shine it there instead if he was not avenged. Zeus agreed, and once the ship finally set sail again, he struck it with a thunderbolt in open water, destroying the vessel entirely and drowning every man aboard except Odysseus himself, who clung to a fragment of the wreckage and drifted for days until he washed ashore, utterly alone for the first time since leaving Troy, on the island of the nymph Calypso. Calypso took him in, and what began as rescue gradually became captivity of a gentler but no less real kind. She fell in love with him and kept him on her island for 7 long years, offering him immortality and eternal youth if he would simply stay and forget his home entirely. Odysseus, though treated well, spent those years yearning for Ithaca and for his wife, Penelope, and was often found sitting on the shore staring out at a sea that refused to carry him anywhere. It was Athene, who had favored Odysseus throughout the entire war and voyage, who finally petitioned Zeus on his behalf, arguing that Poseidon's grudge, the lasting consequence of blinding his son Polyphemus all those years earlier, had punished the wandering king more than enough. Zeus agreed, and with Poseidon conveniently away visiting distant lands, sent Hermes to Calypso with a direct command: release Odysseus and let him build a raft to finally continue his journey home. Calypso, though heartbroken, obeyed the command from Olympus and helped Odysseus build a sturdy raft, providing him with supplies and a favorable wind to send him on his way after 7 years of captivity. But Poseidon, returning and spotting his old enemy finally within reach of freedom, raised a violent storm that tore the raft apart, leaving Odysseus struggling in open water, saved only by a protective veil given to him by a sea goddess and by Athene's continued intervention, calming the waves just enough to let him swim, exhausted beyond measure, to the shore of a new and unfamiliar land. He collapsed naked and half-drowned beneath some bushes near the shore, and it was there, the next morning, that Nausicaa, daughter of the local king, found him while washing laundry with her attendants near the river mouth. Rather than fleeing in fear at the sight of a shipwrecked stranger, she treated him with a kindness and hospitality that stood in sharp contrast to nearly everything Odysseus had faced since leaving Troy, providing him with clothing and directing him toward her father's palace. The land was Scheria, home to the Phaeacians, a seafaring people ruled by King Alcinous, who welcomed the still unnamed stranger into his halls with a generosity that bordered on reverence, feasting him, entertaining him with music and athletic games, and only gently pressing him, once he had eaten and rested, to reveal who he truly was and how he had come to wash up so battered on their shore. It was there in the halls of the Phaeacians that Odysseus finally revealed his identity and told the entire story of his 10-year journey from the fall of Troy. The Cicons, the Lotus Eaters, Polyphemus, Aeolus, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of the sun, and his long captivity with Calypso, an account so remarkable that his hosts sat in rapt silence through the telling. Moved enough by his suffering and his longing for home that King Alcinous offered him something no one else in the entire voyage had been willing or able to provide: safe, swift passage the rest of the way to Ithaca, no strings attached, no trials required. The Phaeacian ship, famous for a speed that bordered on the magical, carried Odysseus home while he slept, and set him gently on the shores of Ithaca before he had even woken, leaving him alone on the beach of his own kingdom for the first time in 20 years, since he had first sailed away to fight at Troy. He did not recognize it at first. Athene, wanting him to move carefully rather than rush blindly into a homecoming that might not be safe, disguised the island's landscape in mist and disguised Odysseus himself as an agging beggar, wrinkled, bald, and dressed in rags, so that he could assess the situation in his own home before revealing himself to anyone. And the situation, it turned out, was dire. In his prolonged absence, presumed dead by nearly everyone except his wife, over 100 suitors from the noble families of Ithaca and the surrounding islands had descended on his palace, courting Penelope for her hand, and with it, claim to the throne, while shamelessly consuming his household's wealth in an endless string of feasts, drinking his wine and slaughtering his livestock as though the palace already belonged to them. Penelope, faithful and clever in her own right, had held them off for years using a trick of her own. She promised to choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, and then secretly unraveled each night's work before dawn, keeping the shroud perpetually unfinished until a servant finally betrayed her secret and the suitors forced her to complete it. Odysseus's son, Telemachus, barely an infant when his father left for Troy and now grown into a young man, had spent his own recent months searching for news of his father, traveling to the courts of old war companions like Nestor and Menelaus, guided and encouraged throughout by Athene in various disguises, though he returned home with no definite answers, only rumors and the fading hope that his father might still be alive somewhere in the world. Athene, disguised as an old family friend, had urged Telemachus into that same journey months earlier, encouraging him to leave the suitor-infested palace and seek word of his father directly from the men who had fought beside him at Troy. He sailed first to Pylos, where the aged King Nestor, garrulous and endlessly fond of recounting his own glory days, received him warmly, but could offer no real news of Odysseus's fate, only stories of the war's end and the scattered, difficult homecomings of the other Greek commanders. From there, Telemachus traveled on to Sparta, where Menelaus and Helen, now fully reconciled and ruling together as though the war that had cost so many lives had never come between them, welcomed him as the son of an old and valued comrade. Menelaus told him of his own long, storm-tossed detour through Egypt on the way home, and of wrestling the shape-shifting sea god Proteus on a deserted beach to force a prophecy from him, learning through that struggle that Odysseus was, at that very time, alive but trapped, weeping on Calypso's distant island, longing for a home he had no way to reach. It was this fragile, second-hand thread of hope, along with Athene's own quiet guidance, drawing father and son steadily closer together across the width of the wandering sea, that finally brought Telemachus home to Ithaca just in time to be reunited with the father he had spent his entire life waiting to meet. Guided by Athene to the hut of his loyal swineherd, Eumaeus, Odysseus, still disguised as a beggar, was received with a warmth and generosity that revealed exactly how deeply his household staff had remained devoted to him even after 20 years and no word of his fate. It was here that Telemachus, returning from his own travels, was reunited with his father, Athene briefly lifting the disguise so the two could recognize each other and begin plotting together how to deal with the suitors who had overrun their home. Still disguised, Odysseus made his way to his own palace to gather information and gauge the loyalty of those inside before revealing himself. At the gate, he passed a dog lying neglected and flea-ridden on a dung heap, Argos, the very hound he had raised and trained himself as a puppy before leaving for Troy 2 decades earlier, now old, abandoned, and dying. Despite the disguise that had fooled everyone else, Argos recognized his master's scent and voice instantly, weakly raising his head and thumping his tail, and then, as though he had simply been waiting all these years for this one final moment, closed his eyes and died, having seen his master come home at last. Inside, Odysseus endured open humiliation from the suitors, who mocked the ragged beggar, hurled a footstool at him when he asked for food, and treated him with a casual cruelty that only confirmed everything Telemachus and Athene had already told him about how thoroughly they had abused his household's hospitality. Penelope, still unaware of her husband's true identity, met with the disguised beggar and spoke with him at length, drawn in by his knowledge of Odysseus and his kingdom, though she had no way to know she was speaking to her own husband face to face. It was here that an old nurse, Eurycleia, tasked with washing the beggar's feet as custom demanded, noticed a distinctive scar on his thigh, a wound from a boar hunt in his youth, and realized in an instant of shock exactly who stood before her. Odysseus, seizing her by the throat before she could cry out and alert the household, swore her to secrecy, needing just a little more time before the suitors could be dealt with. Penelope, meanwhile, had reached the limit of what stalling could accomplish. She announced a contest to finally settle the matter of remarriage. Whichever suitor could string Odysseus's old hunting bow, a weapon so powerful that no one but Odysseus himself had ever managed to draw it, and then shoot an arrow cleanly through the aligned holes of 12 axe heads set in a row, would win her hand. One by one, the suitors tried and failed even to bend the bow enough to string it, growing increasingly humiliated and frustrated as the contest dragged on without a single one of them coming close to success. It was then that the disguised beggar asked to try his own hand at the challenge, provoking outrage and mockery from the suitors, who saw it as an insult that a ragged stranger would even attempt what their finest men had failed to accomplish. Telemachus, in on the plan, insisted his mother's guest be allowed his turn, and with Penelope sent from the room at Telemachus's urging, Odysseus took up his own bow for the first time in 20 years. He strung it with an ease that stunned the watching suitors, and sent an arrow flying cleanly through all 12 axe heads in a single shot. Before the shock could even fully register, Odysseus threw off his beggar's rags, revealing himself at last, and turned the bow on the suitors themselves, striking down their leader with an arrow through the throat before any of them fully understood what was happening. What followed was a slaughter every bit as brutal, in its own way, as anything on the plains of Troy. With Telemachus, Eumaeus, and a loyal cowherd at his side, and Athene's own guidance steering the outcome, Odysseus cut down suitor after suitor in the great hall of his own palace, the doors sealed to prevent any escape, until every single man who had spent years devouring his household and courting his wife lay dead on the floor. The disloyal servants who had aided or slept with the suitors during his absence were executed as well, a brutal restoration of order after years of violation. Penelope, informed of the slaughter, but still cautious after so many years of hopping and being disappointed, refused to believe the stranger claiming to be her husband without proof, testing him with a final private trick of her own. She ordered a servant to move their marriage bed out of their bedroom for the stranger to sleep in. Odysseus, genuinely angered by the suggestion, revealed a secret only the two of them could know, that the bed had been built by his own hands around the trunk of a living olive tree, rooted immovably into the ground, and could never be moved without destroying it entirely. Only her true husband could know that detail, and Penelope, finally certain, broke down and embraced him, 20 years of grief and hope and uncertainty dissolving at last into a reunion neither of them had truly let themselves believe would ever come. There was still one final threat to face. The families of the slain suitors, furious and grieving, rose up in an attempt at vengeance, led by the father of the suitors' fallen leader, and Odysseus, along with his agging father Laertes, whom he had gone to reunite with in the countryside, prepared to fight one last battle to defend everything he had just reclaimed. It was Athene, once more, who intervened directly, appearing before both sides and, with Zeus's own blessing, imposing peace on the entire island, ending the conflict before it could spiral into another cycle of endless retaliation and grief. Odysseus, after 20 years away, 10 spent fighting at Troy, 10 more spent wandering the wine-dark sea through storms, monsters, temptations, and losses that had claimed every single man who sailed with him, was finally home, restored to his wife, his son, his father, and his kingdom. The long and punishing journey that began with a golden apple and a foolish young prince's choice on a distant mountainside finally, truly at its end. Not every survivor of that final night in Troy was Greek. Aeneas, the same Trojan prince Diomedes had once nearly killed on the battlefield before Aphrodite swept him to safety, escaped the burning city carrying his elderly father, Anchises, on his own back and leading his young son by the hand, his wife lost somewhere behind him in the chaos and fire, never to be found again despite his desperate attempts to search the burning streets for her. Warned in a vision to flee rather than stay and die defending a city already lost, Aeneas gathered a small band of fellow survivors and sailed out into the same wine-dark sea that had swallowed so many other lives across this mythology, beginning a long and difficult journey that would eventually, according to the Romans who adopted and expanded his story centuries later, bring him to Italy, where his descendants would one day found Rome itself, a deliberate, powerful claim by later Roman poets that their entire civilization descended in an unbroken line from the ashes of Troy, giving the fallen city one final, unexpected legacy far beyond anything its own defenders could have imagined as the flames closed in around them. The Greek victors, meanwhile, discovered that surviving the war itself was no guarantee of a peaceful return. These scattered homecomings became known collectively as the Nostoi, and nearly every one of them carried its own particular tragedy. Ajax the Lesser, a swift but reckless warrior distinct from the towering Ajax who had died by his own hand over Achilles' armor, committed a sacrilege during the sack of Troy, dragging Cassandra from the altar of Athene's temple, where she had sought sanctuary, that so offended the goddess she had once favored the Greeks that she petitioned Poseidon to destroy the returning fleet with storms. Ajax's own ship was wrecked, and though he survived by clinging to a rock and boasting that he had escaped the god's wrath entirely on his own strength, Poseidon, hearing the boast, split the rock beneath him with his trident and let the sea finally claim the man the storm alone had failed to kill. Menelaus and Helen, sailing for Sparta, were blown badly off course themselves and spent years wandering the coast of Egypt and other distant lands before winds and fortune finally allowed them to complete the journey home, arriving with a fortune in foreign treasure, but having lost nearly as many years to their own detour as Odysseus lost to his. Diomedes returned to Argos only to find his own wife unfaithful in his absence, driven to it, in one version, by Aphrodite's lingering resentment over the wound he had dealt her on the battlefield years before, and he was forced to abandon his kingdom and sail on to found new cities in Italy rather than face the ruin of the home he'd fought so long to return to. Neoptolemus, Achilles' own son, who had fought fiercely in the war's final days and helped bring about Troy's fall, met his own end years later at Delphi, killed in a dispute at the very oracle that had shaped so much of his father's fate, closing out the story of Achilles' bloodline in a manner as abrupt and violent as so much of what had come before it. Of every homecoming attempted by the men who had sailed to Troy, only Odysseus's stretched on so long, tested so thoroughly, and ended so completely, not because the gods hated him more than they hated the others, but because one god in particular, wounded in his pride by the loss of a beloved son, had decided that Odysseus's journey home would serve as a very long, very personal lesson in exactly how much a single god's anger could cost a single mortal man. The stories did not end simply because the last suitor fell in Odysseus's hall or the last ember of Troy finally went cold. They kept traveling the way all the best stories do, carried first by voice alone, long before anyone thought to write them down. For centuries, this entire sweeping history, the birth of the cosmos out of chaos, the fall of the Titans, the long and complicated reign of the Olympians, the doomed and glorious lives of heroes like Heracles and Theseus and Jason, the 10 brutal years at Troy and the 10 more spent finding a way home from it, existed only as memory, passed from parent to child, poet to audience, generation to generation. Reshaped slightly with every retelling the way a river reshapes its own banks over time. Bards traveled from town to town, carrying these tales in their memory alone, singing them to the rhythm of a lyre in the halls of kings and the courtyards of ordinary households alike. And no two performances were ever quite identical, each singer adding a detail here, smoothing over contradiction there, keeping the stories alive by keeping them flexible. It was Homer, whether a single poet or, as many modern scholars suspect, a tradition of poets working under one shared name, who eventually gave the story of Troy and Odysseus's long journey home the form that would outlast nearly everything else from that ancient world, weaving centuries of oral tradition into the Iliad and the Odyssey, two epic poems so complete and so masterfully constructed that they became the bedrock of Greek education and identity for 1,000 years afterward. Hesiod, working in roughly the same era, did something just as essential in a different direction, gathering the tangled, often contradictory stories of the gods' origins into the theogony, the closest thing the ancient world had to a definitive account of how chaos had first given way to Gaia, Uranus, the Titans, and eventually the Olympians who ruled above them all. What's remarkable, looking back at this entire sweep of mythology from beginning to end, is how little of it is actually about the gods behaving admirably. Zeus is unfaithful and often cruel. Hera's jealousy causes as much suffering as her husband's wandering eye. Even Athene, wisest of the Olympians, punishes an innocent woman for the crime committed against her, transforming Medusa rather than Poseidon, and destroys Arachne for nothing more than being honest and talented at the same moment. These were not stories designed to present the gods as role models. They were stories designed to explain a universe that often felt exactly this unfair, one where lightning struck the innocent as easily as the guilty, where beauty could be a curse as easily as a blessing, where the wisest choice a person could make sometimes led, through no real fault of their own, directly into catastrophe. That's part of why these stories have survived so completely intact through nearly 3,000 years, told and retold across languages, empires, and entire civilizations that rose and fell in between. When the Romans conquered Greece, rather than discarding its mythology, they absorbed it almost entirely, renaming the gods to fit their own pantheon. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Poseidon became Neptune, Ares became Mars, Aphrodite became Venus, while keeping nearly every story, every labor, every love affair and betrayal essentially intact beneath the new names. It is largely through Roman poets like Ovid, whose metamorphoses retold so many of these transformation myths: Arachne, Narcissus, Pygmalion, Midas, and dozens of others, with such vivid psychological detail that many of these stories reached the medieval and Renaissance world at all. And reach that world they did, in ways that shaped far more of daily life than most people realize even now. Look up on a clear night, and much of what you're seeing carries these stories directly into the modern sky. Orion, the great hunter, still strides across the winter constellations, placed there, in one version of his myth, after Artemis accidentally killed him and grieved so deeply that she asked Zeus to honor him among the stars forever. Callisto, one of Zeus's lovers, transformed into a bear by a jealous Hera and nearly killed by her own son while hunting, was placed in the sky as the Great Bear, with her son following close behind as the Little Bear, forever chasing but never quite catching up to the mother he never knew he'd nearly killed. Cassiopeia, the boastful queen whose pride set the entire chain of events leading to Andromeda's chaining and Perseus's rescue into motion, sits in the sky still, in some tellings condemned to spend half her endless nights hanging upside down as one final, humbling touch on her vanity. Even language itself is saturated with these stories in ways most people use every single day without realizing where the words came from. Someone with an unstoppable, monumental strength is described as having a Herculean task ahead of them. A single, fatal weakness hidden within an otherwise powerful person or system is their Achilles heel. A seemingly wonderful gift that brings hidden disaster is a Pandora's box. An unattainable goal, always visible but forever out of reach, is described as tantalizing, a word drawn directly from Tantalus and his eternally retreating fruit. A repetitive, endless, and ultimately pointless task is called Sisyphean. Excessive self-love and vanity is called narcissism, a term borrowed directly from the boy who wasted away staring at his own reflection. A journey full of episodic adventures is an odyssey. A gift that turns out to be a disguised trap is a Trojan horse, a phrase that made its way, centuries later, directly into computer science to describe malicious software disguised as something harmless. Even panic traces back to the god Pan, whose sudden appearance in the wild was said to startle travelers into a blind, irrational terror. The stories reshaped how entire civilizations thought about the human mind, too, long after anyone still worshipped Zeus or poured libations to Poseidon before a sea voyage. When the field of psychology began developing vocabulary for patterns of human behavior in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it reached instinctively for this same well of stories, because these myths had already done the work of namming universal, uncomfortable truths about the human condition centuries before psychology existed as a formal discipline. Sigmund Freud named an entire cluster of unconscious desires and rivalries after Oedipus, the king who fulfilled the very prophecy he ran his whole life trying to escape. Carl Jung drew on Greek mythology just as heavily, seeing in these ancient figures a kind of shared symbolic language for the human psyche, patterns so consistent across cultures and centuries that he came to believe they reflected something built into the deepest architecture of the human mind itself, archetypes as old and as universal as birth and death. Art history is, in enormous part, a 2,500-year-long conversation with these same stories. The temples of ancient Greece themselves were built as homes for these gods, their friezes and pediments carved with scenes from exactly the myths already told here: the birth of Athene fully armed from her father's head, the battle between gods and giants, the labors of Heracles rendered in marble along the length of entire buildings. When that world faded, its stories did not fade with it. Renaissance painters, centuries later, rediscovering classical texts and classical ideals of beauty after a long medieval interlude focused almost entirely on religious subjects, turned back to Greek mythology as though returning to an old, familiar language. Botticelli painted Venus rising from the sea foam in the same manner Aphrodite herself was born, cast in scallop shell and golden hair. Michelangelo, alongside his religious commissions, sculpted figures drawing on the same classical ideals of the heroic human body first celebrated in Greek art centuries earlier. Bernini captured, in marble so soft-looking it seems to yield under fingertip, the exact moment Apollo's fingers close on empty air as Daphne transforms into a laurel tree to escape his pursuit. one more of the countless myths about mortals and nymphs fleeing the unwanted attention of the gods, her father, a river god, granting her prayer to be transformed rather than caught. Composers found the same well endlessly inspiring. Operas retold the story of Orpheus descending into the underworld for his lost Eurydice again and again across different centuries and different languages, each version finding something new in that same devastating final backward glance. Ballet staged the judgment of Paris, the labors of Heracles, the fall of Troy. Even now, walk through any major museum in the world, and entire wings will be devoted to vases, statues, and paintings depicting scenes from these same stories. Zeus in his various disguises, Athene and Poseidon vying for the patronage of a city that would eventually take Athene's name and become Athens itself. The two of them competing, according to legend, by each offering the city a gift, Poseidon striking the ground to produce a spring of seawater, of limited practical use, and Athene offering an olive tree, a gift of food, oil, and wood that so plainly outmatched her uncle's offering that the city's people chose her without hesitation. A small, almost gentle myth of divine rivalry compared to so much of what surrounds it, but one that still shapes how an entire modern city understands its own name and its own founding legend. That same appetite for these stories has never really faded, only changed its medium. The 20th and 21st centuries turned Greek mythology into blockbuster films, animated features watched by children who could not yet find Greece on a map, novels that reimagined the war at Troy or the voyage of Odysseus from perspectives the ancient poets never thought to explore, video games that let players walk the very underworld Odysseus once visited only in memory and prophecy. Every generation, it seems, finds its own way back to this same collection of stories, drawn by the same qualities that made them worth telling in the first place. Gods flawed enough to feel recognizable, heroes brave enough to inspire and human enough to fail, and an entire universe built on the uncomfortable, enduring truth that power, pride, love, and grief have never really changed shape. No matter how many thousands of years separate the person hearing the story from the person who first imagined it. What began in absolute nothing, a formless, silent chaos with no shape and no name, had grown story by story, generation by generation, into an entire civilization's understanding of itself, its gods, its fears, and its own fragile mortal place in a universe ruled by beings who loved, betrayed, mourned, and raged with an intensity that mortal lives could only ever hope to echo. The Titans fell, the Olympians rose. Heroes lived brief, blazing lives, and died reaching for glory or paid dearly for chasing it too far. A war was fought over a single stolen woman and ended an entire civilization in a single night of fire. A king spent 10 years finding his way back to a wife who had never once stopped waiting for him. And somewhere, on a quiet night thousands of years later, someone still looks up at Orion standing guard over the winter sky, or reaches instinctively for the word Herculean to describe an impossible task, or watches a wooden horse roll through a city gate in a film they've seen a dozen times before, and without even realizing it, becomes the newest voice in a story that has never actually stopped being told. Now remember, if you've made it this far into the video, please like and subscribe and comment your favorite part.